Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. January 9th, 2015, started like any other Friday. I just finished my shift at the construction site and picked up my wife, Darla, and stepdaughter, Brooke, from the mall. The mist was getting thick as we pulled into our driveway at Canyon Lake. Our house sat on a small hill about 200 yards from the water, with a decent view of the lake when it wasn't foggy as hell like tonight. "Can you grab the groceries while I get the door?" Darla asked, juggling her purse and a couple shopping bags. "Sure thing," I said, backing up the truck to get closer to the steps. That's when I saw it. My high beams cut through the mist and lit up something standing at the edge of our property, maybe 40 yards away. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear? Too tall. A man? No way. This thing stood at least 9 feet high. Its body was covered in grayish-blonde fur that seemed to absorb the light in patches. What hit me hardest were the shoulders, massive, spanning easily 4 feet across. It turned toward our headlights, and for a split second, I could make out the outline of its face, though the details were lost in shadow and distance. "Lucas, what are you staring at?" Darla's voice snapped me back. "Look!" I pointed, but by then, whatever it was had vanished into the mist. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Brooke asked from the back seat, not even looking up from her phone. "Nothing," I muttered, putting the truck in park. "Must have been a deer." But I knew it wasn't a deer, not even close. I didn't mention it again that night. What was the point? They'd think I was crazy, and honestly, I was starting to think maybe I was. The next morning I walked out to where I'd seen the thing, but the ground was hard and rocky, no tracks, no sign anything had been there. For the next week, I kept looking out the windows at night, expecting to see it again. Nothing showed up. Then came January 16th. I was working overtime, so Darla and Brooke decided to take a walk along the shoreline. It was a clear, cold afternoon, and they'd been cooped up all week. My phone rang around 3 p.m. "Lucas," Darla's voice was shaking, "you need to come down to the shore. We found something awful." 20 minutes later, I was standing with them at the water's edge, staring at what was left of a white-tailed doe. The deer's neck was snapped and twisted completely around, its head facing backward. The belly was torn open, organs removed with what looked like surgical precision. Parts of the haunches had been eaten, but not in the messy way coyotes or wild dogs would do it. "What could have done this?" Brooke asked, her face pale. I noticed something odd right away. There was a streak of blood at the water's edge, about 15 feet from where the carcass lay, but there was no blood trail connecting the two spots. It was like something had killed the deer at the water, then picked it up and thrown it 15 feet inland. "You two head back to the house," I said. "I want to look around a bit more." After they left, I crouched down to examine the carcass more closely. That's when I found the stone. It was wedged under the deer's hide, partially hidden. About the size of my palm, one edge was sharp, almost like it had been worked that way. There was flesh and blood on it. I set it aside and kept looking. 10 feet away, propped against a stunted live oak, I found a stick about 5 feet long. One end had been sharpened to a point, and there were deer hairs and bits of flesh stuck to it. My blood ran cold when I realized the implications. These weren't just tools or natural items that happened to be at the scene. They were weapons. The most disturbing thing was the angle of attack. All signs pointed to the deer being taken from the waterside, not from the woods. Whatever killed it had been in the lake, waiting. I walked along the shoreline for about 50 yards in each direction. That's when I found the footprints. The ground was softer here, muddier. 3 distinct sets of prints pressed into the earth. The largest measured 19 inches from heel to toe. The next was 14 inches, and the smallest was still 11 inches long. They were humanoid in shape, but wider across the ball of the foot. 5 toes, but the big toe didn't splay out like a human's would. I took photos with my phone, using my hand for scale. Then I gathered the stone and stick and headed home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen in the headlights a week earlier. 9 feet tall, grey blonde fur, those massive shoulders. The next morning I called the game warden. He came out, looked at the deer carcass, which was now picked over by scavengers, and shrugged. "Probably coyotes," he said. "Maybe a mountain lion, though we don't get many around here." When I showed him the footprints, he smiled like I was pulling his leg. "Those are just washed-out deer tracks," he said. "Rain and erosion make 'em look weird sometimes." I didn't show him the stone or stick. I could tell he wasn't taking this seriously. Over the next 3 weeks, I found 5 more deer carcasses around our property and the neighboring shoreline. All showed the same pattern: broken necks, missing organs, partial consumption. One had its skull crushed like an eggshell. Another had deep puncture wounds in its chest that didn't match any animal attacks I'd ever seen. I started documenting everything, taking photos, noting locations, preserving what evidence I could. After finding the 3rd carcass, I finally told Darla the whole story, including what I'd seen that night in the headlights. "You think it's Bigfoot?" she asked, not laughing, which I appreciated. "I don't know what it is," I admitted, "but whatever it is, there's more than one of them." By the end of January, I'd contacted a group called the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. They connected me with an investigator named J.D. who drove down from Austin to look at my evidence. J.D. was a serious guy in his 50s, ex-military by the look of him. He spent 3 days combing our property and the shoreline, taking plaster casts of the footprints I'd found and documenting the kill sites. "This is definitely not normal predation," he said on his last day here. "I've seen deer taken by cougars, wolves, coyotes, bears. None of them process their kills like this." He pointed to the latest carcass we'd found, a young buck with its organs neatly removed. "See how the intestines are laid out? They're not scattered or torn apart like scavengers would do. They're placed deliberately." He moved some leaves with a stick. "And look at the way the hide is peeled back. That's not animal behavior. That's processing." "So what are we dealing with?" I asked. J.D. frowned. "I think you know what you saw, Lucas. My job is just to document it." Before he left, we found something else. About 100 yards from the last kill site, tucked into a small clearing, was a pile of stones, not just randomly dumped, but stacked in a deliberate pattern. The largest stone on the bottom was about 2 feet across. The smallest at the top was the size of a softball. "They mark territory this way sometimes," J.D. said quietly. "It's a sign." 2 days after J.D. left, I found a chicken near our property line. Its head was missing, and the body was carefully covered with grass and small twigs. Not buried, just covered, like something was saving it for later. We don't keep chickens, neither do any of our neighbors. I called J.D. again, and he drove back down. He took more photos, more notes. When he was done, he sat at our kitchen table looking through his files. "You're not the only one with reports in this area," he finally said. "There was a sighting in New Braunfels last month, another near San Marcos in December, but yours is the only one with this much physical evidence." "What should we do?" Darla asked. She'd taken to keeping Brooke inside after school and making sure all our doors and windows were locked at night. "Nothing aggressive," J.D. warned. "Whatever these creatures are, they haven't directly threatened you. They're hunting deer, not people. If they wanted to harm you, they would have by now." That wasn't exactly comforting. February rolled on, and something strange happened. The killings stopped. No more deer carcasses, no more footprints along the shore. It was like whatever had been there had simply moved on. By the end of February, life had almost returned to normal. Almost. I still found myself scanning the tree line when I came home at night, still checked the shore every weekend, still kept the doors locked and a loaded shotgun in the bedroom closet. One night in early March, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something heavy moving on our dock. We have a small wooden dock that extends about 20 feet into the lake. It creaks when you walk on it, and those were definitely creaks I was hearing. I grabbed the shotgun and my flashlight and moved quietly to the back door. Darla stirred but didn't wake up. Through the kitchen window, I could see the dock illuminated by moonlight. Empty. I stepped outside, the wooden porch boards cold under my bare feet. The night was clear and still, with just a slight breeze rippling the lake's surface. I walked down to the dock, sweeping my flashlight across the wooden planks. That's when I noticed the water dripping from the dock's edge. Fresh drips, like something had just climbed out of the lake onto the dock, then back into the water. I crouched down and shined my light on the wet spots. Next to one of them was a print, just a partial one, pressed into the soft wood of an older plank, 5 toes, wide across the ball of the foot. Even though it was just the front half of the foot, I could tell it matched the tracks I'd found along the shore. I stood up quickly, sweeping my light across the lake's surface. Nothing but ripples and the distant shore, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I backed up to the house, keeping my eyes on the water. Just before I reached the steps, I saw it, a disturbance in the water about 50 yards out, like something large moving just below the surface, heading away from the dock. The next morning, I called JD again. "They're in the water," I told him. "That's why we haven't seen them. They're moving through the lake." "It makes sense," he said after a pause. "There are underwater cave systems all through that region. Some of them connect to the aquifer. It would explain how they move around without being spotted." "What do I do?" I asked. "Nothing," he said firmly. "They're moving on. Let them go." That was 2 years ago. We haven't had any more sightings or found any more kills. JD tells me there have been reports further south, near San Antonio, and then later toward the coast. Whatever passed through Canyon Lake that winter seems to be following its own migration pattern. Sometimes when I'm out on the dock at night, fishing or just sitting, I'll hear splashes too big to be fish, see ripples that shouldn't be there on a calm night. And I remember what I saw in my headlights that misty January evening, 9 feet tall, grey-blonde fur, those massive shoulders. I don't know what hunts in Canyon Lake. I don't know if it has a name science would recognize, but I know it's real. I know it's intelligent, and I know it uses tools, marks territory, and processes its kills with a purpose. Most of all, I know it's still out there somewhere, moving through the water, waiting at the edges, hunting. The locals would tell you to stay away from the shore after dark. They'd say it's because of snakes or gators or the odd cougar, but I know better. And now, so do you. But story 2. The dashboard clock read 2:37 p.m. when everything I thought I knew about the world changed. The heater in my 98 Thunderbird was cranking full blast, barely keeping up with the bitter January cold. Snow had been falling steadily since we crossed the main state line, blanketing the roadside pines with 3 inches of fresh powder. Derek was dozing in the passenger seat, his Tennessee-born ass not used to real winter. The trip from Knoxville had been long, and we were only about 40 minutes from my place in Oakfield. "Wake up, city boy," I said, nudging Derek's shoulder. "We're almost there," Derek groaned, stretching his lanky frame as much as the car allowed. "Jesus, Marcus, it's like driving through a damn Christmas card out here." I chuckled. "This ain't nothing. Wait till February when we get proper snow." Route 17 cuts through some of the densest forest in Aroostook County. Most days I appreciate the isolation. Growing up here made the woods feel like home. I'd spent more nights than I could count hunting these forests, tracking deer by moonlight or camping under the stars. The road was empty that afternoon, just us and miles of wilderness. "Slow down," Derek said suddenly, sitting up straight. "I think I saw something." I eased off the gas, scanning the tree line. Probably a moose. They're all over up here. A moose? For real? Derek pressed his face against the passenger window like a kid at a zoo. That's when I saw movement through the trees. Something large pushing through the underbrush about 30 yards off the road. I slowed to a crawl, thinking I could give Derek his first Maine wildlife sighting. There, I pointed. Watch the clearing coming up. The Thunderbird's tires crunched over packed snow as we rolled forward. Derek was fully awake now, eyes wide with anticipation. I was smiling, ready to see his reaction to his first moose encounter. But what stepped out from between those trees wasn't a moose. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. A massive figure emerged from the tree line, walking upright on two legs. It moved with purpose, each step covering 3 feet of ground. In 3 strides, it was at the road's edge. In 2 more, it stood directly in front of my car. I slammed the brakes. The Thunderbird skidded slightly, coming to a stop no more than 15 feet from the thing. "What the fuck is that?" Derek's voice cracked. I couldn't answer. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Standing in front of us was a creature at least 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick reddish-brown hair, like a coonhound, but shaggier. The hair hung longer on its forearms and lower legs, almost like natural gauntlets. Its shoulders spanned at least 3 feet, with a chest twice as broad as mine, but it was the face that froze my blood. Partially visible beneath the hair was dark, grayish-blue skin. Despite the freezing temperature, it showed no signs of discomfort. Deep-set eyes peered out from under a prominent brow ridge, solid black orbs with no whites visible. Its nose was broad and flat, nostrils flaring as it seemed to scent the air. I'd hunted these woods my entire life. I knew every animal native to Maine. This wasn't one of them. Derek started screaming, not yelling or shouting, actual high-pitched screaming that filled the car. I should have hit the gas. I should have reversed. I should have done something. Instead, I sat paralyzed, staring at the impossible thing blocking our path. The creature's head tilted slightly. It hunched down, dropping to a crouch that still left it taller than my car's hood. Its face lowered to windshield level. It was looking directly at us, studying us. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out Derek's continued screams. The creature's breath fogged the glass. This close, I could see intelligence in those black eyes, awareness and calculation that no animal should possess. Without warning, it straightened up. In a single bound that defied its massive size, it leaped across the entire width of the road. It landed on the opposite embankment, snow exploding around its feet. The creature scaled the roadside slope in 2 strides, then paused at the top. It turned back, those black eyes finding mine again across the distance. Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees with impossible speed and silence for something so large. 10 seconds passed, 20. The only sound was Derek's breathing, now coming in ragged gasps. "Did you fucking see that?" he finally wheezed. My hands were shaking as I put the car in drive. "Yeah, I saw it." "What was it? A bear? Some kind of mutant bear?" His voice had a hysterical edge. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs like that." My mouth was bone dry. "Not for that long, and not in January. They're hibernating." "Then what the hell was it, Marcus?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The speedometer read 80 as we tore down Route 17, neither of us looking at the woods anymore. Derek flew back to Tennessee 3 days later. We barely spoke about what happened, but I caught him staring into the woods from my porch, jumping at every sound. Before he left, he made me promise never to tell anyone what we saw. "They'll think we're crazy," he said, "or drunk." I agreed, but the memory ate at me. I'd spent my entire 34 years in these woods. I'd tracked black bear, moose, and coyote. I'd camped alone in the deepest parts of the forest from April through November every year since I was 16. The woods were more home to me than any 4-walled structure. But after that day on Route 17, everything changed. 2 weeks after the encounter, I tried to go hunting. I had my Remington 700, a full pack, and perfect tracking conditions. I made it half a mile into the tree line before the feeling hit me, the certainty that something was watching me. The hair on my neck stood up. My hands went clammy despite the cold. I turned around and walked straight back to my truck. Pete Sawyer at the general store noticed the change. "Haven't seen you heading out with your gear lately," he commented one March morning as I paid for coffee. "Season's almost over." "Just taking a break," I lied, "working on the house." The truth was, I couldn't make myself enter those woods alone anymore. Not since the encounter. Not since seeing something that shouldn't exist. By April, I'd convinced myself I needed to face my fears. I called my nephew Ethan, who had just turned 22 and had been hunting with me since he was 14. I suggested we go after coyote near Lakewood, about 15 miles from where Derek and I had our encounter. "Hell yeah," Ethan said. "Been waiting for you to call. Mom said you've been acting weird." We set out at dusk on a clear Friday evening. Spring was coming, but the nights were still cold. The forest smelled of pine sap and thawing earth. For the first time in months, I felt almost normal again. The familiar weight of my rifle, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and Ethan's company eased my nerves. We hiked about 2 miles in, setting up in a small clearing with good sightlines down a ravine. Coyotes use the natural path as a highway between hunting grounds. We got comfortable, backs against a large oak, and settled in to wait. The first hour passed uneventfully. Occasional owls hooted in the distance. A fox barked somewhere to our east. Normal forest sounds that had once been comforting. "So, what's really going on with you?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice low. "Mom says you haven't been in the woods in months." I considered telling him about the creature. Instead, I shrugged. "Just needed a break, I guess." "Bullshit," Ethan said, but he didn't press further. Around 9:30 p.m., we heard the first coyote calls. Distant yips echoed through the trees, moving our way. I signaled to Ethan, and we readied our rifles, but the coyotes never arrived. The yipping stopped abruptly, giving way to an unnatural silence. No owls, no rustling leaves, nothing. The forest went completely still. "What's happening?" Ethan whispered. "Shh." I raised my hand, listening intently. The sound came from the north, a low, rumbling growl that no coyote could produce. It rolled through the valley like distant thunder, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The growl built in intensity until it broke into something between a roar and a howl. My blood turned to ice. That sound wasn't made by any animal native to Maine. Ethan's eyes widened. "What the fuck was that?" Another howl answered the first from the east, closer to our position. Then a third from the west. The sounds converged, moving toward us. "We need to go," I hissed, already on my feet. "Now." "But the coyotes." "Forget the damn coyotes." I grabbed his arm, yanking him up. "Move." We ran, abandoning stealth for speed. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots threatened to trip us in the darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, no longer caring if it gave away our position. Behind us, another howl split the night, closer now. "Marcus, what are those things?" Ethan gasped as we ran. "Just keep moving." We reached my truck in record time. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them. Ethan snatched them from the ground and unlocked the doors. We threw our rifles in the back and jumped inside. I cranked the engine and reversed down the logging road, tires spinning in mud before finding purchase. As we turned onto the main road, Ethan pointed into the darkness. "There, in the trees!" I didn't look, I didn't want to see. I hit the gas, and we sped away. We were halfway back to my place when Ethan finally spoke again. "Uncle Marcus, what were those things? Those weren't coyotes." I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. "No, they weren't." "Then what? Bears don't sound like that either." I took a deep breath. "About 3 months ago, something happened on Route 17. Something I haven't told anyone about." I told him everything. The creature in the road, its impossible size, the intelligence in its eyes. the way it moved. As I spoke, Ethan's expression shifted from disbelief to horror. "You think that's what we heard tonight?" he asked when I finished. "I think there's more than one," I said, "and I think they're territorial." That was a month ago. I haven't been back to the woods since. I can't even bring myself to step into my backyard after sunset. The deck where I used to spend summer evenings watching deer at the forest edge sits empty. I called Derek last week. It took 3 attempts before he finally picked up. "I can't talk about it, Marcus," he said immediately. "I heard them again," I told him anyway. "Me and my nephew. There's more than one." Silence on the line. Then, "I haven't slept right since January. I keep dreaming about those eyes. We need to tell someone, the game warden, the sheriff, someone." Derek laughed, a hollow sound. "And tell them what? We saw Bigfoot. They'll lock us up." "I've been researching," I said. "There are reports all through New England. Northern Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. People have seen these things for decades. So what? What are we supposed to do about it?" It was a fair question. What could we do? No one would believe us without evidence, and I wasn't about to go looking for proof, not after hearing those howls converging on us in the darkness. "I don't know," I admitted, "but they're out there." After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the tree line visible through my living room window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my yard. For my entire life, I'd seen the forest as a sanctuary, a place where I belonged. Now it was alien territory. The game cameras I ordered arrived yesterday, 5 high-definition trail cams with night vision and motion sensors. I haven't decided if I'm actually going to place them. Part of me wants proof. Part of me is terrified of what I might capture. What I do know is this. What we encountered on Route 17 wasn't human. It wasn't a bear or a moose or any known animal. It was something caught between worlds, too human to be animal, too animal to be human, and it wasn't alone. Last night I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of something heavy moving across my front porch. The floorboards creaked under substantial weight. My dog Tucker, usually quick to bark at raccoons or deer, stayed silent. He cowered under my bed, whimpering softly. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Whatever was out there paused directly in front of my bedroom window. The curtains were drawn, but I could sense it standing there, separated from me by only glass and thin fabric. Minutes passed. Eventually, the heavy footsteps moved away. In the morning, I found prints in the mud by my porch steps. They were 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions, much too large for a bear, much too shaped like a foot to be anything else. I've lived in Maine all my life. I thought I knew these woods. I thought I knew what lived in them. I was wrong. There are things in the forest, ancient things that have always been here, watching us from the shadows, things that could tear a man apart without effort. I used to be at home in the wilderness. Now I understand that I was only ever a visitor, tolerated by forces I never understood. The forest isn't mine anymore. Maybe it never was. The sun is setting again. From my window, I can see the trees swaying in the breeze. Beautiful, inviting, deadly. I won't be going into those woods again. Not alone. Not at night. And if you ever find yourself driving down Route 17 in January, keep your eyes on the road. Don't slow down for wildlife, and pray to God that nothing steps out of the trees in front of you, because once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. Once you know they're out there, you'll never feel safe in the woods again. Story 3. I tapped the steering wheel in rhythm with the radio as we drove home. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:37 p.m. October nights get dark early in Everett Falls, and this one was particularly black beyond our headlights. My wife Natasha sat beside me, scrolling through her phone. "That movie wasn't worth the drive," I said, glancing at her. Natasha looked up. I don't know, Tyler. The plot was decent, but the dialogue was terrible. 2 hours of my life I'll never get back, I chuckled, turning my attention back to the empty stretch of US Route 1 ahead. We'd made this drive countless times, from our small town of Everett Falls to the mainland and back, usually in daylight. The wooded areas that lined the highway seemed different at night, more dense, more alive somehow. A single streetlight appeared in the distance, creating a small dome of yellow light in the darkness. The trees crowded in on both sides of the road there, their branches reaching over the pavement like gnarled fingers. "Did you read that article I sent you about the harbor seal population?" Natasha asked. She worked as a marine biologist at the research center near Millport Bay. I started to answer when something caught my eye at the edge of the road, just beyond the pool of light from the street lamp. "Hold on," I said, easing my foot off the accelerator. "I think there's a deer." We were still about 100 yards from the streetlight. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but not the edges clearly. I could make out movement, something large shifting near the tree line. "Where?" Natasha leaned forward, peering through the windshield. As we drew closer, the shape became more distinct. My first thought evaporated instantly. This was no deer. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, slowing the car to about 20 miles per hour. The figure stood at the roadside, partially illuminated by the streetlight above. It was tall, much taller than a person should be, 7 feet at least. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms hung down past where knees would be on a human. The body was lean, but visibly muscular even from this distance. "Tyler," Natasha's voice was tight. "That's not a person." "I can see that," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. We were close enough now that I could make out more details. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, its posture hunched but unmistakably bipedal. It was covered in hair, not clothing, but actual hair. A uniform reddish-brown color that reminded me of orangutans I'd seen at the zoo. The creature's head turned toward our approaching car. The face was mostly in shadow, but I caught a glimpse of deep-set eyes reflecting our headlights. Just that brief look sent a chill racing down my spine. I slowed the car even more, now barely crawling forward at 10 miles per hour. The creature's head swiveled from our car to look over its shoulder, as if checking for something behind it. Its movements were jerky, but deliberate. "Should we stop?" I asked, though my instincts screamed against it. Before Natasha could answer, the creature seemed to make a decision. It hunched lower, and in one fluid motion it dropped to all 4s. What happened next burned itself into my memory. The thing launched itself forward with explosive power. Its gait was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not like a bear, not like a human crawling. Its hands curled under, and it ran on what looked like knuckles, propelling itself with its long arms and powerful legs in a catapulting motion that covered ground with shocking speed. "Jesus Christ!" I gasped. The creature crossed the road in 3 or 4 bounds, moving so fast that it seemed to blur in the headlights. As my brain struggled to process what I was seeing, movement at the roadside caught my attention again. A second creature burst from the tree line, smaller, maybe half the size of the first, but moving with the same unnatural speed and coordination. It followed the same path across the road, clearly in pursuit of the larger one. In seconds, both creatures disappeared into the forest on the opposite side of the road. I brought the car to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway. The engine idled quietly. Neither of us spoke for what felt like minutes. "Did you see that?" Natasha finally whispered. I nodded, unable to form words. "Tyler, what were those things?" I shook my head. I don't know. We should call someone," she said, reaching for her phone. "Who?" I asked, a bubble of nervous laughter escaping me. "The police?" "And tell them what? That we saw Bigfoot and baby Bigfoot running across the road?" "Those weren't bears, Tyler." Natasha's voice was firm, professional, her scientist's mind already working on the problem. "The morphology was all wrong. Bears don't move like that, and they were bipedal before they started running." I know they weren't bears, I said, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. We should report it, she insisted. And sound completely insane, I countered. No one would believe us. A car appeared in the distance behind us, headlights growing larger in the rearview mirror. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal, eager to get away from that spot. We can't just ignore what we saw, Natasha said. I'm not ignoring it, I replied. I just don't know what to do about it. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, both lost in our thoughts. The familiar streets of Everett Falls seemed different somehow, as if the world had shifted on its axis. The comfortable reality I'd known had cracked open, revealing something impossible underneath. I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. Neither of us moved to get out. They were watching us, Natasha said quietly. The way it looked at the car before it ran, it was aware of us. I know, I said. And there were two of them, a large one and a small one, like a parent and child, I finished. The implications hung in the air between us, not just unknown creatures, but a family unit, intelligence, social structure. Let me do some research, Natasha said as we finally got out of the car. There have been sightings around here before, I'm sure of it. Inside our house, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, something I'd never felt compelled to do before. It wasn't fear of break-ins that motivated me now, but a new awareness that the world outside contained things I couldn't explain. Natasha was already on her laptop at the kitchen table, typing rapidly. There are dozens of reported sightings in this region, she said without looking up, dating back decades. I poured myself a whiskey, needing something strong to steady my nerves. People see all kinds of things in the woods, especially at night. Not like this, Tyler. She turned the screen toward me. Look at these descriptions. I skimmed the web page she'd found, a collection of eyewitness accounts from throughout the Pacific Northwest. Tall, hair-covered bipedal creatures, unusual gait, knuckle-walking. The descriptions matched what we'd seen with eerie accuracy. This could be anything, I said weakly. People making stuff up, misidentifying known animals. You know that's not true, she replied. We both know what we saw. I took a long sip of whiskey. So what are you saying? That Bigfoot is real and we just saw one? Two of them? I'm saying there's something out there that science hasn't classified yet, Natasha said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when discussing her research. Some kind of undocumented hominid species. That's impossible, I said. We've mapped the entire planet. There can't be a 7-foot-tall ape-man species just hanging out in the woods without anyone having definitive proof. The oceans cover 70% of the Earth, and we've explored less than 20% of them, she countered. New species are discovered every year. Why is it so hard to believe that a highly intelligent, elusive primate could avoid detection, especially in remote forests? I had no good answer for that. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's fluid movement, the unnatural length of its limbs, the way it had looked directly at us before fleeing. I kept hearing sounds outside our bedroom window, branches creaking, leaves rustling, normal forest sounds that suddenly seemed ominous. The next morning over coffee, Natasha broached the subject again. I want to go back there, she said, today in daylight. Look for tracks or hair samples. Are you serious? I asked. Completely. This could be important, Tyler, a major discovery. Or it could be dangerous, I countered. What if these things are territorial? What if they see us as a threat? They ran from us, remember? They were afraid of us, not the other way around. I wasn't convinced. We don't know what they were running from. Maybe there was something else out there, something worse. Natasha studied me for a moment. You're really scared, aren't you? Aren't you? I asked. I'm fascinated, she replied. This is potentially groundbreaking. This is potentially how people disappear in the woods, never to be seen again. After some debate, we compromised. We would drive by the spot in daylight. If it seemed safe, we'd pull over and take a quick look around. No venturing deep into the forest, no separating, and we'd leave at the first sign of anything unusual. The location looked different in daylight, less menacing, more ordinary. Just a stretch of highway with dense forest on either side, a single streetlight standing sentinel. We parked on the shoulder and got out of the car. "It came from over there," I said, pointing to the section of trees where we'd first spotted the creature. Natasha nodded and headed in that direction, her eyes on the ground. I followed reluctantly, scanning the tree line constantly. "Look at this," she called after a few minutes of searching. I joined her at the edge of the forest. She pointed to an area where the underbrush was disturbed, branches broken at about chest height. "Something big came through here," she said. "Could be deer or a bear," I suggested. "Maybe. Let's check the road." We crossed back to the asphalt. Natasha crouched down, examining the surface. "There," she said, pointing. "See those marks?" I knelt beside her. There were indeed marks on the road. Scuff marks that didn't match tire tracks or animal prints I recognized. "These could be from anything," I said. "They're spaced exactly the way you'd expect if something was running on all fours," she insisted. "Wide stance, powerful push-off." She stood and measured the distance between marks with her steps. About 7 feet between strides. That's incredible. The evidence, if you could call it that, wasn't convincing me. But Natasha's excitement was building. She crossed to the other side of the road, where the creatures had disappeared into the forest. "Tyler, come here," she called, her voice tight with excitement. I jogged over to find her standing at the forest's edge, pointing at something on a tree trunk about 6 feet up. "Hair," she said. Sure enough, several coarse, reddish-brown hairs were snagged on the rough bark. Natasha carefully collected them in a small plastic bag she'd brought for this purpose. "I can get these analyzed at the lab," she said. "DNA testing. And if they come back as something unknown, then we have evidence," she replied. We spent another hour searching the area, but found nothing else definitive. As we walked back to the car, I felt eyes on us. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made me keep looking over my shoulder. "We should go," I said. Natasha nodded, seemingly satisfied with our findings for now. The DNA analysis took weeks, during which time our lives returned to a semblance of normalcy. We didn't talk much about what we'd seen. I think we both worried that putting it into words too often would either diminish the experience or make it too real to handle. When the results finally came back, they were inconclusive. "Contaminated sample," was the official response. Not human, not any known primate, but not enough viable DNA to make a determination. Natasha was disappointed, but not deterred. "That's how these things always go," she said. "It's why there's no definitive proof, but we know what we saw." As months passed, the memory remained vivid, but became something we rarely discussed. Once, after too many beers with friends, I started to tell the story but stopped when I saw the skeptical looks on their faces. Even I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The incident changed us in subtle ways. Natasha became more involved in cryptozoology forums online, though she kept this interest separate from her professional work. I found myself more alert when driving at night, scanning the roadside with a mixture of dread and hope. The most profound change was in how we viewed the wilderness around us. The forests that surrounded our town had always been a place of beauty and recreation. Now they held mystery and the slightest edge of menace. Not because what we'd seen was necessarily dangerous, but because it represented a gap in our understanding of the world. There were things out there, intelligent things, moving through the same spaces we occupied, largely unseen and unknown. How many times had I hiked those woods, unaware that I was being watched? How many times had these creatures silently moved away as humans approached? A year after our sighting, we were at a dinner party when the conversation turned to local legends. Someone mentioned rumors of strange creatures in the national forest. "It's just people seeing bears walking upright," one guest said dismissively. "They can do that, you know." "Or people who've had too much to drink while camping," another added with a laugh. Natasha caught my eye across the table. We shared a silent moment of understanding. We knew different. We never saw the creatures again, though sometimes when driving that stretch of road at night, I slow down near that lone streetlight, hoping for another glimpse. Natasha occasionally suggests expeditions deeper into the forest, but something always holds me back. Not fear exactly, but respect. Whatever lives in those woods has survived by remaining hidden. Perhaps that's how it should be. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed in those rare, fleeting moments when different worlds briefly intersect. But I know what I saw that October night, and I know that the line between the known and unknown world is thinner than most people realize. Sometimes, all it takes is being in the right place at the wrong time, and everything you thought you understood about reality changes forever. Story 4. I'll never forget that morning. October 17th, 1998. The kind of fall morning where the fog hangs so thick you can barely see the hood of your car. I'd made this drive hundreds of times before. The 5 a.m. trek from my little house outside Madisonville to the hospital where I worked as a nurse's aide. Usually, I'd cruise down old Nolan Road without much thought, my mind on the day ahead or still half asleep. But not that morning. I remember checking my watch as I pulled out of the driveway. 4:52 a.m., still dark. The headlights of my Plymouth Horizon cut weak yellow paths through the dense fog, barely illuminating 10 feet in front of me. The trees on either side of the narrow country road were just shadows, vague outlines in the murky grey. I hunched forward over the steering wheel, driving at maybe 15 miles per hour, squinting hard, like that would somehow help me see better. The radio was tuned to some early morning talk show, volume low. I wasn't really listening, just background noise to keep me company. My thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, still too hot to drink. The heater was running full blast against the October chill, making the windows fog up around the edges. I remember thinking about how I needed to stop at the grocery store after my shift ended. My grandson Tommy was coming over that weekend, and that boy could eat his weight in frozen pizza. The road curved slightly to the left, and I eased off the gas even more, creeping around the bend. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark mass in the middle of the road. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a deer hit by a car, a large dog. But as I got closer, slowing to a crawl, I realized it was way too big for either of those. I stopped the car about 15 feet away and flicked my high beams on. The shape was right on the center line of the road. It was curled up, like something sleeping or hurt. My first thought was maybe someone had been thrown from a motorcycle, but there was no wreckage, just this thing. It was huge, massive, lying there in what looked like a fetal position, knees drawn up. Even curled in on itself, it took up most of the narrow country road. My Plymouth was small, but there was no way I could have squeezed around it on either side without going into the ditch. I sat there for a few seconds, hands gripping the wheel tight. Should I honk? Try to go around? Back up and find another route? Before I could decide, the thing started to move. What I saw next is something that still gives me nightmares. The creature uncurled and stood up, but not like anything human. It didn't roll over and push itself up with its arms or struggle to its feet. It just rose, smoothly, fluidly, like it was being pulled up by strings. One continuous motion from lying down to standing. No human moves like that, especially not something so large. Once it was up, it stayed hunched over. Its back was to me, and I could see now it was covered in hair or fur, blackish brown, the color of old tree bark. The hair wasn't uniform. It hung in shaggy, messy clumps of different lengths. There were bits of forest debris tangled in it, twigs, leaves, maybe pine needles. But the arms, God, the arms. They hung down way past where arms should end, almost to its knees. As it started to move, it swung one arm way out in front of its body and the other behind. This exaggerated pendulum motion that no person would make. It began turning toward me, but never fully faced me. It was like it was deliberately avoiding looking directly at my headlights. I just caught the edge of its profile before it moved toward the woods on the driver's side of the car. I sat there frozen, hands clenched so tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles ached. My breath was coming in short gasps, fogging up the windshield. The creature moved off the road with that same weird gait, one arm swinging far forward, the other back. 3, maybe 4 strides, and it disappeared into the fog and trees on the left side of the road. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. My whole body was shaking. When I finally got the nerve to move, I hit the gas so hard the tires spun on the wet pavement before catching. I drove the rest of the way to work in a daze, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Later that day, I called my son-in-law Jeff, who stands 6'6" and weighs about 280. I asked him to meet me on Old Nolan Road after my shift. When he got there, I had him stand in the road where I'd seen the thing. "Jeff," I said, my voice still shaky even hours later, "that thing was at least a head taller than you, even hunched over like it was, and twice as wide." He looked at me for a long moment, then up at the trees around us. "You really think you saw a Bigfoot, Teresa?" Before that morning, I would have laughed at the question. I'd always thought Bigfoot was nonsense, stories made up by attention seekers or people who'd had too much moonshine. I was a practical woman who dealt in facts, temperatures, medications, bandage changes, not monsters in the woods. "I don't know what I saw," I told him, "but it wasn't human and it wasn't a bear." That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing up with that unnatural fluid motion. I heard leaves rustling outside my bedroom window and nearly jumped out of my skin. By morning, I'd decided one thing for certain. I was never driving down Old Nolan Road again, no matter how much longer the alternate route to work would take. The next day, I took Hopkins Road to get to work. It added 15 minutes to my drive, but I didn't care. I told my supervisor, Diane, about what happened, and she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Teresa Miller, I've known you for 12 years, and you've never been one for tall tales," she said, stirring creamer into her coffee. "You sure it wasn't just a bear?" "Bears don't stand up like that," I said, "and they don't have arms that hang down past their knees." Word got around the hospital fast. By lunch, everyone was talking about Teresa's Bigfoot. Some people were genuinely interested, asking questions about details. Others just smirked behind their hands. Larry from maintenance started making these exaggerated ape sounds whenever I walked by. I stopped talking about it after a couple of days, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went to the library and checked out every book they had on Bigfoot sightings. Most were ridiculous, blurry photos that could have been anything, second-hand stories that changed with each telling, but some had details that matched exactly what I'd seen. The unusual gait, the way it avoided looking directly at light sources, the smooth way it went from lying to standing. A week after my encounter, I was sitting at my kitchen table with the books spread out around me when the phone rang. It was Marjorie Klein, who lived about a mile down Old Nolan Road from where I'd seen the creature. "Teresa, Sally at the diner told me about what you saw," she said without preamble. "I think maybe you should come over for coffee." An hour later, I was sitting in Marjorie's cluttered living room, a mug of coffee cooling in my hands. Her husband, Earl, sat in a recliner across from us, barely acknowledging my presence except to nod when I came in. "We've lived on this property for 43 years, Marjorie said. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us, you understand?" I nodded, something in her tone making my skin prickle. Back in '76, Earl was coming home late from his shift at the plant, about the same time of morning you were driving. He came in white as a sheet, shaking so bad he could barely talk. She glanced at her husband, who was staring fixedly at the muted TV. Told me he'd seen something in the road, something big that stood up and walked into the trees. "You saw it too?" I asked Earl directly. He finally looked at me, his weathered face expressionless. "Didn't see nothing," he said flatly. "Just a big animal, probably a bear." Marjorie gave him a look that spoke volumes, then turned back to me. It wasn't just Earl. My cousin's boy Tommy saw something similar back in '82, up near the old quarry. And the Wilsons' place, 3 miles down the road, they used to keep horses. Something spooked those animals so bad one night that they broke right through the fence. 2 of them ran themselves to death, they were so scared. "Did anybody report these things?" I asked. Marjorie laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "To who? Sheriff Braddock? He'd have had us committed. Besides," she lowered her voice, even though it was just the 3 of us in the house, "there's folks around here think that, whatever these things are, they're best left alone. You go poking round, drawing attention, and maybe they stop being so shy." I left Marjorie's house with more questions than answers. On the drive home, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. Over the next few months, I became that person I'd always rolled my eyes at, the one with the crazy obsession. I kept a map on my dining room wall, marking every local story I could find that might be related to what I saw. I joined online forums where people shared Bigfoot experiences. Most were obvious lies or misidentifications, but some rang true in a way I couldn't explain. My daughter Melissa was worried about me. She came over one Sunday afternoon in January, took one look at my wall of research, and sat me down at the kitchen table. "Mom, I'm concerned," she said, in that gentle voice she used with difficult patience at her dental practice. "This isn't like you. You've always been so rational." "I know what I saw, Melissa," I said, hating the defensive tone in my voice. "I'm not saying you didn't see something," she replied carefully, "but maybe it wasn't exactly what you think it was. It was foggy. It was dark. You were tired. It was 15 feet away from me in my high beams," I snapped. "It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume, and I wasn't hallucinating." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, you haven't been the same since Dad died, and I get it. I miss him too. But this fixation isn't healthy." I pulled my hand away. Jack had been gone 3 years by then. Yes, I still missed him every day, but this had nothing to do with him. "This isn't grief, Melissa. This is real." She left shortly after, promising to call me later in the week. I stood in the doorway watching her drive away, wondering if maybe she was right. Was I losing my grip? Was this some weird delayed reaction to losing Jack? That night, I took down all my notes and maps, packed away the books, decided I needed to let this go for my own sake and for Melissa's. I even made an appointment with Dr. Winters to talk about grief counseling. But then the dreams started. In the dreams, I'm back on that foggy road, but instead of staying in my car, I get out. I walk toward the creature lying in the road. Sometimes I reach out to touch it. Sometimes I just stand there as it rises up. But every time, it turns to face me fully, and every time I wake up right before I see its face, my heart hammering in my chest, sheets soaked with sweat. After 2 weeks of these dreams, I decided to go back to Old Nolan Road. Not to drive it, I still took the long way around to work, but to look at the spot in daylight. It was a Sunday afternoon in February, cold but clear. The trees were bare, giving me a better view of the woods on either side of the road. I parked on the shoulder near where I thought the encounter had happened, got out of the car, zipping my jacket against the chill. The road looked so ordinary in the daylight. Just cracked asphalt with yellow lines, potholes from the winter freeze-thaw. I walked to the center of the road, standing where the creature had been lying. The woods were quiet except for the occasional car passing on the highway half a mile away. I turned slowly, taking in the surroundings I hadn't been able to see in the fog that morning. On the left side of the road, where the thing had disappeared, there was a small game trail leading into the trees. It wasn't obvious, just a slight parting in the underbrush, a narrow path of compressed leaves and twigs, the kind of trail deer make over time. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I stepped off the road and followed the trail. The woods were open enough that I could still see the road behind me. The path led down a gentle slope, winding between trees. It wasn't maintained, but it was definitely used regularly by something. About 50 yards in, the trail opened into a small clearing, and there, in the center of the clearing, was a structure. Not a building exactly, more like a shelter. Branches and limbs leaned against each other, forming a crude dome about 8 feet tall. Smaller branches were woven between the larger ones, making walls that would block wind and probably shed water. The whole thing was covered with pine boughs, dead leaves, bark, natural camouflage that made it blend almost perfectly with the surrounding forest. I stood at the edge of the clearing, not daring to go closer. This wasn't made by kids playing in the woods. The structure was too large, too sturdy, and some of the branches used in its construction were thicker than my arm, not something a child could break or carry. As I stared at the shelter, I became aware of a smell, musky, wild, like wet dog but stronger, with something else underneath I couldn't identify. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. A feeling of being watched pressed down on me so strongly I almost couldn't breathe. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the structure. When I reached the trail again, I turned and walked quickly back toward the road, fighting the urge to run. The sensation of eyes on my back didn't fade until I was in my car with the doors locked. I sat there for a long moment, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Then I started the engine and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Lawson was on duty that Sunday, a young man who'd been 2 years behind Melissa in school. He listened to my story with a polite but skeptical expression. "Mrs. Miller, we get reports like this more often than you'd think," he said when I finished. "Usually turns out to be black bears. They can stand up on their hind legs, look real human-like in the right light." "This wasn't a bear," I insisted. "And that shelter I found? Bears don't build structures." He sighed, putting down his pen. "Could be homeless folks living rough. We've had problems with that out by the old quarry, or hunters building a blind. In the middle of the woods away from any road or trail? And how do you explain what I saw in October?" "Ma'am, I'm not saying you didn't see something, just that there's likely a normal explanation." He pushed his chair back. "How about this? I'll drive out there tomorrow, take a look at this structure. If I find anything concerning, I'll let you know." I knew he was humoring me, but it was better than nothing. I gave him detailed directions to the clearing and left, not expecting much to come of it. Deputy Lawson called me the next afternoon. "Mrs. Miller, I checked out that spot you told me about," he said, his voice different than it had been the day before. Tighter, somehow. "Found the game trail, followed it down to where you said the clearing was. And," I prompted when he paused, "there was definitely something there recently. Ground was disturbed, vegetation trampled down in a circular pattern, but no structure." "What? That's not possible. It was there yesterday, a big dome made of branches and—" "Ma'am," he cut me off, "I'm not saying you didn't see something. Just that whatever was there is gone now. Completely gone. No branches, no debris, nothing left behind. Like someone came through and cleaned the whole area." A chill ran through me. Someone, or something. There was a long pause on the line. "Mrs. Miller, this stays between us, all right? I found tracks in that clearing. Not human tracks. Too big, wrong shape. Not bear tracks either. I've hunted enough to know the difference. What did they look like? I whispered. Like really big bare human feet, but the proportions were all wrong. Toes too long, arch too pronounced. Another pause. I took photos, but I'm not filing an official report. Sheriff would have my badge if I started a Bigfoot panic. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, thinking. Whatever I'd seen that foggy morning wasn't just passing through. It lived in these woods. Had maybe lived here for decades, based on what Marjorie had told me, and now it knew I had found its home. That was 4 years ago. I still work at the hospital, still take the long way around to avoid old Nolan Road. Deputy Lawson sent me the photos he took of those tracks, but made me promise never to share them or mention his name. Melissa still worries about me, but I've stopped talking about what happened, and she's convinced I've moved on. I haven't. Sometimes at night, I hear noises around my house, shuffling footsteps in the yard, scratching at the siding. Once, a strange, rhythmic tapping on my bedroom window that went on for nearly an hour. I never look, never get up to check. Just lie still in my bed, pretending to be asleep. And sometimes on trash day, I find my garbage cans moved from where I left them. The lids carefully removed and set aside, certain items taken, usually food wrappers or containers. Once, a hairbrush I'd thrown away. I don't know if it's curious about me or warning me or something else entirely, but I know it's out there, watching. I know what I saw that foggy morning was real, and I know enough now to leave it alone. Some things in this world aren't meant to be pursued or explained. Some mysteries should stay mysteries. But every time the fog rolls in thick on an October morning, I remember how it rose from the road with that impossible fluid grace, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd seen its face. I'm glad I never found out. Story 5. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel as I hit the last stretch of Highway 61. It was 10:50 p.m. on May 6th, and I'd been driving for 7 hours straight from a veterinary conference in Nashville. The new Ford F-150 handled well on the dark roads, its LED headlights cutting through the Kentucky night like searchlights. Being a vet with a specialization in large mammals meant I knew every animal in these parts, or so I thought. I'd seen 6 deer already, their eyes catching my headlights before they bolted back into the trees. That's why I didn't think much of it when I spotted those green eyes on the small hill to my right, about 250 yards ahead. But something was off. The eyes were iridescent green, almost like glow sticks, and they sat too high off the ground for a typical whitetail. I eased off the gas slightly, squinting through the windshield. The eyes remained fixed, unblinking, for about 4 seconds. Then they simply vanished, not the gradual turn away of a deer, but a sudden disappearance, as if someone had flipped a switch. Weird, I muttered, accelerating back to 65 Mitterfair, 3 or 4 miles north of the Tennessee-Kentucky border. This stretch was densely wooded and barely populated. The nearest town, Burkesville, was still 20 miles ahead. I reached to turn up the heat, the spring night cooler than expected. That's when I saw them, a second set of eyes, this time aqua blue, glowing just 25 yards ahead on the right side of the road. "Jesus Christ!" I shouted, instinctively jerking the wheel slightly left. These eyes weren't at deer height. They weren't at bear height either. They towered above the guardrail, which I knew from my work with the highway department stood 3 feet tall. These eyes were at least 9 to 10 feet off the ground. As my headlights swept across the spot, I caught a glimpse of something massive standing beside the guardrail. It was upright, bipedal, a silhouette darker than the surrounding forest. Before I could process more details, I blew past it at full speed. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool air blasting from the vents. I checked my rearview mirror, but the road behind me disappeared into darkness. Then movement to my right caught my attention. Down the embankment that ran alongside the highway, Another set of aqua blue eyeshine reflected in my headlights. This time, the angle and my high beams provided enough illumination to see more. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. A huge dome-shaped head. Not a bear, not any animal native to Kentucky. The head had a pronounced brow ridge, heavy and Neanderthal-like. There was an odd clump of hair above its right brow, curled downward in a distinctive cowlick. I could only see the right eye clearly, reflecting that unnatural aqua blue light. The thing was facing partially away from me, looking down the embankment. I had covered maybe 100 yards since passing the first creature when my side mirror filled with movement. A third figure. This one was moving alongside my truck, keeping pace at 65 mph. It glided down the embankment with impossible grace, its massive form somehow flowing smoothly over the uneven terrain. No human could move that fast through brush and trees, especially not in near darkness. No human stood that tall either. I floored the accelerator. The engine roared as the truck surged forward, speedometer climbing past 80. My hands trembled against the steering wheel. For 3 or 4 seconds, the thing kept pace, running parallel to my truck about 30 feet to my right. It moved with athletic precision, powerful limbs eating up the distance. Its body was covered in what looked like black hair with patches of brown. Where the hair thinned around what must have been its chest and face, I could make out lighter skin underneath. Then the creature veered deeper into the woods and disappeared. I didn't slow down for the next 10 miles. My breathing came in ragged gasps. Every shadow at the roadside made me flinch. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those glowing blue eyes gaining on me. When I finally rolled into the gas station at Burkesville, I sat in my idling truck for 5 full minutes, trying to steady my hands. The fluorescent lights of the convenience store provided little comfort. What I'd seen didn't make sense, but I knew what I'd seen. The night clerk looked up from his phone as I entered. "You all right, mister? Looked like you seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Long drive. Just need some coffee." "Highway 61 gets mighty dark this time of night," he said, pressing a button on the coffee machine. "Whereabouts you coming from?" "Tennessee, heading up to Louisville." I hesitated, then asked, "You ever hear stories about anything strange on that stretch of road, near the state line?" The clerk's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of strange you talking about?" "I don't know. Large animals, maybe. Unusual sightings." He slid my coffee across the counter. $3.55. I handed him a 5. "Keep the change." As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "My granddad used to hunt those woods. Came back one day, hung his rifle over the fireplace, never went back in. Wouldn't talk about why. Something's best left alone, if you ask me." I nodded and pushed through the door, the bell jingling behind me. Back in my truck, I gulped the scalding coffee, unconcerned about the pain. The caffeine did little to settle my nerves. I needed to document this while it was fresh. Opening the Notes app on my phone, I typed out everything I'd seen. The eye colors, heights, movements, physical descriptions. The typing helped calm me. Facts, data. This was how I processed the world as a medical professional. Whatever I'd encountered, approaching it methodically made it less terrifying. I added my location coordinates and the exact time. I debated for 20 minutes whether to call the local sheriff before deciding against it. Without evidence, and with the creatures now miles behind me, what would I say? That I'd spotted Bigfoot, 3 of them? My mind rebelled against the word, but what else fit? Too tall for bears, too fast for humans. Those strange glowing eyes, the massive dome-shaped heads, the hair-covered bodies. I pulled back onto the highway and drove the remaining distance to Louisville in a state of hypervigilance. Every stand of trees potentially concealed watchful eyes. Every shadow might contain a 10-foot figure. I kept my speed above 70 the entire way. By the time I reached my hotel at 1:30 a.m., exhaustion had replaced fear. I checked in mechanically, dragged my suitcase to the room, and collapsed onto the bed without undressing. Despite my fatigue, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those aqua-blue eyes staring back at me. At 3:12 a.m., I jerked awake from a half-sleep, certain I'd heard something scraping at my fourth-floor window. The room remained quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Still, I got up and double-checked the lock on the door. By morning, having slept perhaps 2 hours total, I almost convinced myself I'd experienced some sort of highway hypnosis, a waking dream caused by fatigue and monotony. Almost. Over breakfast in the hotel lobby, I searched my phone for animal attack reports or unusual sightings near Highway 61. Nothing recent appeared. I did find an old newspaper article from 1978 describing a truck driver who claimed a giant hairy man had stepped in front of his vehicle near the Kentucky-Tennessee border. The article treated it as a joke. The veterinary conference resumed at 9 a.m. I sat through 3 presentations on advances in equine surgery, retaining almost nothing. During the lunch break, I found myself sketching what I'd seen on a napkin: the dome-shaped head, the pronounced brow, the distinctive cowlick above the right eye. A colleague sat down across from me, Dr. Sarah Wilkins from the University of Tennessee. "That's interesting," she said, nodding toward my sketch. "Working on a new species." I crumpled the napkin. "Just doodling." "Well, your doodle looks a lot like the reconstructed skull profile of Gigantopithecus blacki, the extinct giant ape." She bit into her sandwich. "Though yours has more of a sagittal crest than the fossil record suggests." I stared at her. "You're familiar with Gigantopithecus?" "Did my undergraduate thesis on great ape evolution. Gigantopithecus fascinated me. A 9 to 10 foot ape that potentially coexisted with early humans. Some cryptozoologists connect it to Bigfoot legends." She laughed. "Though I wouldn't mention that connection in academic circles unless you want your funding cut." I pushed my untouched lunch aside. "What if those legends aren't just legends?" Sarah's smile faded. "Don't tell me you're one of those Bigfoot hunters." "I'm not. I'm a scientist. I believe in evidence and observable phenomena." I leaned forward. "But what if I told you I observed something last night that defies conventional explanation?" For the next 20 minutes, I described my encounter in clinical detail. Distances, dimensions, coloration, movement patterns. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from amused to concerned to genuinely intrigued. "The eyeshine is particularly interesting," she said when I finished. "Aqua-blue reflection suggests a tapetum lucidum like we see in nocturnal predators, but that's not consistent with known great ape physiology." "So you think I imagined it?" She hesitated. "I think you saw something. Whether it matches what you think you saw is harder to determine. Stress, unexpected encounters, darkness, they all affect perception." "I know what I saw, Sarah." "Then document it. Properly." She pulled out a business card and wrote on the back, "This is Billy Ransom, wildlife biologist at Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. If anyone can help you make sense of this, it's him. He's open-minded but rigorous." I took the card. "Thanks. And Tom?" She lowered her voice. "Be careful who you tell about this. People are quick to label and dismiss." I nodded, pocketing the card. "I'm aware of how it sounds." That evening I called Billy Ransom. After a brief, cautious introduction, he agreed to meet me the following day after my conference ended. We met at a diner in Louisville. Billy was in his 50s with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of fieldwork rather than laboratory research. He listened to my account while methodically working through a plate of meatloaf. "That stretch of 61 has a history," he said finally. "Not official reports, mind you, but locals tell stories." "What kind of stories?" "Hunters finding deer carcasses in trees 15 feet up, cattle going missing without predator signs, strange vocalizations that don't match known wildlife. I leaned forward. You believe the stories. I believe in unexplained phenomena. The gap between what science has documented and what exists is wider than most academics admit. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. Would you be willing to return to the site? Show me exactly where this happened. The idea sent a chill through me. During daylight, maybe. Of course, first thing tomorrow. We agreed to meet at 7 a.m. That night, alone in my hotel room, I questioned my decision. What if returning to the area attracted the creature's attention? What if they recognized me somehow? Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of running through dark forests, pursued by silent, swift shadows. I woke at 5:30 a.m., giving up on further rest. By 6:45, I was waiting in the parking lot of the agreed-upon gas station, anxiously checking my watch every few minutes. Billy arrived in a mud-splattered Department of Fish and Wildlife truck at exactly 7. He carried a backpack and what looked like camera equipment. "Ready?" he asked, transferring his gear to my truck, "as I'll ever be." We headed south on Highway 61. In daylight, the road seemed ordinary, the surrounding forest less threatening. But as we approached the Kentucky-Tennessee border, my hands tightened on the wheel. "Slow down," Billy said. "We're getting close, based on your description." I reduced speed to 40 mph, eyes scanning the tree line. "There," I said, pointing to a small hill on the right. That's where I first saw the green eyes. Billy made notes on a small pad. We continued driving. "Stop here." I braked where I remembered seeing the creature by the guardrail. Billy was out of the truck before I fully stopped examining the area. I remained behind the wheel, engine running, ready to leave if necessary. "Got something," he called. I reluctantly exited the vehicle. Billy stood by the guardrail, pointing to the ground. Large depressions in the soft shoulder of the road formed what might be footprints, if footprints could be 17 inches long and 8 inches wide. "These are fresh, last day or two." Billy took photographs and measurements. "Look at the depth. Whatever made these was heavy. I'd estimate 700, 800 pounds based on soil compression." I stared at the impressions, memories of the previous night flooding back. There were 3 of them. "Let's check the embankment." We carefully made our way down the slope. The ground here was rockier, showing fewer clear impressions. But Billy found broken branches 8 feet off the ground and tufts of dark hair caught in tree bark. He collected samples in small evidence bags. "I'll have these analyzed," he said. "Could be bear, but the hair patterns and coloration don't look right for black bear, and the height of these breaks is significant. We spent 2 hours documenting the area." Billy pointed out signs I would have missed. Unusual scat deposits, distinctive 5-toed prints in muddy patches, tree trunks with bark scraped away at heights no known animal would reach. "What do you think they were doing here?" I asked as we packed up to leave. Billy surveyed the area once more. "Based on the evidence and your description of multiple individuals moving alongside the road, I'd say they were hunting, probably following the deer you mentioned seeing earlier. This stretch of highway cuts through their territory." "Their territory," I repeated. "You're saying these things are established here?" Billy nodded. "I've tracked similar sign across 5 counties. They stay mobile, following food sources, but this region has all they need. Dense forest cover, water, abundant prey. How is it possible no one's documented them properly? People have reported them for centuries. Native American legends, settler accounts, modern sightings, but they're incredibly elusive, and without a body or clear photographic evidence, science won't acknowledge their existence." As we drove back toward Louisville, I processed what we'd found. The physical evidence matched what I'd seen. This wasn't imagination or highway hypnosis. "What will you do with this information?" I asked Billy. "Add it to my research." I've been building a database of credible encounters for 15 years. Someday, it'll be enough to force scientific recognition." He glanced at me. "What will you do?" I considered the question. "Continue my work, but with new awareness that our understanding of North American wildlife is incomplete. Most witnesses keep quiet, fear of ridicule. I'm a scientist," I said firmly. "If I don't speak up about unexplained observations, who will?" Billy smiled. "That's why I agreed to meet you. Most people who encounter these creatures either deny what they saw or go to the opposite extreme, become obsessed. Finding middle ground is rare." When we returned to Louisville, Billy transferred his equipment to his truck. Before leaving, he handed me a card with a private number. "If you see them again, or if you remember additional details, call me directly." I nodded. "I will." That night, my final one in Kentucky before heading home to Missouri, I slept soundly for the first time since the encounter. The fear remained, but it had transformed into something else. A recognition that the world was bigger, wilder, and more mysterious than I'd understood. In the morning, as I packed my truck for the journey home, I found myself scanning the tree line behind the hotel parking lot. Not out of fear this time, but with new awareness. The creatures I'd encountered had existed alongside humans for centuries, perhaps millennia, managing to remain largely undetected despite their size. I started the engine, wondering what other secrets the forests of America might still hold. The road stretched ahead, and somewhere beyond the concrete and civilization, those aqua-blue eyes watched from the shadows, bearing witness to a world we only thought we knew. Story 6. The radio crackled as I pulled my ranger truck up to the visitor center. "Buddy, we've got a hiker at the front desk wanting to report something unusual. Says it's urgent." "Copy that. I'll be right there." I parked and headed inside. The man pacing by the front desk looked rattled. His large German shepherd sat trembling at his feet, which wasn't something you see every day from a dog that size. "You the ranger?" he asked as soon as I walked in. Sweat stained his shirt despite the cool spring morning. "Park Ranger Buddy Miller," I said, extending my hand. "What seems to be the problem, sir?" "Name's Dean. I was hiking the Cedar Creek Trail with Rex here when—" He paused, glancing around like he was embarrassed to continue. "Look, I know how this is going to sound, but I know what I saw." I nodded. "Why don't we step into my office?" Once inside, Dean leaned forward, keeping his voice low. We were about 2 miles in when Rex started acting weird, growling, hair standing up. Then he barked at something off the trail. When I looked over, he took a deep breath. There was this thing. It stood up from behind a fallen oak. Had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Covered in hair. Not fur like a bear. Hair. Long and dark. I kept my face neutral. "Did it make any sounds or movements toward you?" "No, thank God." Rex went crazy, pulling on the leash to get away. Nearly yanked my arm off. I didn't stick around to see what it would do. I took down the details, location, time, description, while watching Dean's body language. He wasn't drunk or high, just scared. "I'll check it out," I promised. "You did the right thing reporting it." After Dean left, I sat at my desk, staring at my notes. In my 15 years as a ranger in this Kentucky state park, I'd heard stories. All park rangers do. Usually it was just bear sightings misidentified by city folks not used to wildlife. But something about Dean's account felt different. 3 weeks later, I'd nearly forgotten about Dean's report when something happened that I still can't fully explain. It was almost 10 p.m., and I was doing a final patrol along the park's outer road before heading home. The headlights caught something in the middle of the asphalt, a freshly killed deer, male, good-sized buck, probably 125 pounds. No signs of vehicle damage, which was odd. The body was intact, with just some blood pooling from the neck. I drove past it, turned around at the next pull-off, and headed back to clear the carcass from the road. Total time elapsed, maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes tops. The deer was gone. I hit the brakes hard and got out with my flashlight. The blood was still there on the asphalt, glistening wet in my beam. I followed a narrow trail of droplets and disturbed leaves heading up a steep embankment on the north side of the road. Standing there in the darkness, I did the math. That deer weighed as much as an average adult. Something had dragged it up a 45-degree slope in under 2 minutes without making enough noise for me to hear from just down the road. A bear could do it, sure. But bears don't typically grab roadkill and run. They feed on sight, and bears weren't common in this part of Kentucky anyway. I briefly considered following the blood trail, but thought better of it. Whatever took that deer had strength and speed I wasn't prepared to confront alone in the dark. Summer came, bringing the usual influx of campers and day trippers. My nephew Jacob was doing a summer internship with the Park Service, riding along on my evening patrols. Smart kid, studying wildlife management at Eastern Kentucky. It was nearly dusk on a Friday in July 2014 when we came around a bend on Park Road 7 and found 5 deer standing in the middle of the pavement. They were frozen still, which wasn't unusual, deer in headlights and all. What was strange was that they didn't scatter when I slowed the truck. Instead, they stood rigid, every head turned in the same direction, staring into the dense woods to our right. "That's weird," Jacob said, leaning forward in his seat. "What are they looking at?" I stopped the truck completely. The deer didn't move. "Hand me that flashlight in the glove compartment," I said. Jacob passed it over, and I shined it toward the tree line where the deer was staring. For a second, nothing. Then, about 40 yards in, 2 blue eyes reflected back at us. Not the yellow-green eyeshine you get from most mammals. These were vivid blue, and they were spaced about a foot apart. "Holy shit," Jacob whispered. "That's not a deer." "Stay in the truck," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The eyes disappeared as soon as I opened my door. The deer finally broke their trance and bounded away into the opposite woods. "What was that?" Jacob asked when I got back in. "Don't know," I said, "but we're going back to the station for the spotlight." 10 minutes later, we returned to the same spot with the high-powered spotlight from the ranger station. I parked exactly where we'd been before and swept the beam across the tree line. "There!" Jacob suddenly shouted, pointing uphill. Whatever it was had moved about 300 feet up the slope. In the spotlight's beam, I caught a glimpse of one blue eye and the side profile of something standing next to a pine tree. What struck me was the hair, coarse, stringy, grey-brown, visible from what would be ankle to shoulder height. Based on its position next to the tree, I estimated it stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. Then it was gone, moving behind the tree with surprising quickness for something so large. "Did you see that?" Jacob's voice had a slight tremor. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." "That wasn't a bear, Uncle Buddy." "No. I kept the spotlight trained on that spot. It wasn't." The next morning I went back alone. Daylight makes everything seem more normal, more explainable. But what I found didn't offer simple explanations. At the base of the pine tree where we'd seen the figure, the hard-packed ground showed several large depressions. Not distinct footprints. The ground was too dry and compact for that, but compacted areas about 16 inches long that couldn't have been made by any known wildlife in the park. More telling was the tree itself. Fresh bark had been stripped from the side where the creature had stood, about 7 feet up the trunk. Something had peeled it away, leaving sap still oozing from the exposed wood. I took photos and measurements but didn't file an official report. What would I say? That I chased Bigfoot up a hillside? That would be the fastest way to get a psych evaluation and possibly lose my job. Instead, I kept it to myself until a week later when Mitch, another ranger, approached me in the break room. Mitch was a 20-year veteran, as no-nonsense as they come. "Something strange happened on my patrol last night," he said, voice low even though we were alone. "Over by Boulder Creek Road." "What kind of strange?" I asked, suddenly alert. "I thought it was a guy in one of those ghillie suits at first, like hunters wear." Mitch stared into his coffee. "It crossed the dirt road about 50 yards ahead of my truck, moving fast. But the way it moved," he shook his head, "no person moves like that. And it was big, buddy, real big." "You get a good look at it?" "Good enough to know I don't want to see it again." All I could make out was this shaggy hair covering it completely, dark brown, almost black. He looked up at me. "I've been working these woods for 2 decades. Never seen anything like it." "You tell anyone else?" I asked. "Hell no. But I'll tell you this, I'm not patrolling that section alone anymore. Not at night." I nodded. "Smart move." 3 days later, I decided to go deeper into the park's restricted area. There had been old stories among the rangers about strange structures found in the remote sections over the years. Arrangements of sticks and rocks that couldn't be explained by natural occurrences or typical human camping. 5 miles in, well off any marked trail, I found something. It resembled a primitive lean-to, but not made the way humans would build one. Large branches had been broken, not cut, and arranged against a natural rock formation, creating a crude shelter about 8 feet tall at its highest point. At one end, a boulder weighing easily 100 pounds had been placed as if to anchor the structure. It would have taken 2 or 3 strong men to move that rock, yet there were no signs of equipment or human activity around. About 20 yards from the shelter lay the skeleton of a deer. Most of the meat and organs were gone, but what caught my attention was the leg bone. It had been snapped cleanly in half, not chewed through like predators do, but broken with tremendous force, the way you'd snap a dry stick. I'd read accounts of purported Bigfoot behavior, including reports of deer kills where the legs were broken to immobilize the animal. Seeing it firsthand sent a chill through me, despite the summer heat. As I stood there, the forest went silent, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had hit a mute button on the birds and insects. The hair on my arms stood up. Something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I felt the weight of its attention as surely as I felt the ground beneath my feet. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the shelter. I didn't run until I was a good quarter-mile away, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Over the next several months, reports trickled in. Campers hearing wood knocks echoing through the forest at night. Hikers finding strange piles of sticks that would appear overnight on trails. A family reporting an overwhelming stench like wet dog mixed with rotten garbage that followed them for half a mile before suddenly disappearing. I investigated when I could, but never found conclusive evidence. Just more questions. In December 2014, after the first snow, I found tracks crossing a remote fire road. 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, pressing an inch deep into ground that was frozen solid enough that my boots barely left marks. I followed them for half a mile before they vanished into a rocky area where tracking was impossible. That was my last significant encounter before I transferred to another park in early 2015. The official reason was to be closer to my aging parents, but the truth was more complicated. The constant vigilance had worn me down. Every patrol, every night shift became an exercise in controlling my anxiety. I never filed official reports about what I saw. The Park Service doesn't have a form for possible Bigfoot encounter, but I kept detailed personal journals, and I shared my experiences with a small network of other rangers across the state who'd had similar encounters. We're out there every day in places most people only visit occasionally. We see things, most of them we can explain, but sometimes we can't. I don't know what lives in those Kentucky forests. I can't prove anything with scientific certainty. All I have are my experiences, a vanishing deer carcass, blue eyes in the darkness, a primitive shelter no human built, and the constant, unshakable feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the tree line. Something large, intelligent, and determined to remain unseen. Something that doesn't appear in any wildlife management handbook. Something that, officially, doesn't exist. Story 7. My fingers glided across the keys, the melody of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filling the small shed. Outside, darkness had settled over the hills of Marin County. I'd been practicing for nearly 2 hours, lost in the rhythm and flow of the piece. The shed sat at the back of my parents' property, converted into a makeshift music studio with decent soundproofing so I wouldn't disturb them in the main house about 50 yards away. I hit a wrong note and paused. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of the fine hairs on my arms and the back of my neck standing straight up. A chill ran down my spine, despite the mild temperature in the shed. I'd felt this before while hiking the trails that crisscross the protected lands surrounding our neighborhood. Usually it meant something was watching me, a deer, maybe a coyote, or if I was unlucky, one of the mountain lions that prowled these parts. But I'd never experienced it indoors. The piano bench creaked as I shifted my weight. I looked around the small space, my guitar case leaning against the wall, sheet music scattered on the side table, the small space heater humming in the corner. Nothing out of place, nothing to trigger that primal warning system built into human DNA. I shook it off and positioned my hands to resume playing. That's when it happened. Wham! The entire shed shook violently. Dust particles rained down from the exposed beams. My sheet music scattered to the floor. The impact came from directly above me. Something had landed on the roof with tremendous force. I froze, my hands hovering above the keys. The roof creaked under what had to be significant weight. My mind raced through possibilities. A falling branch? No. The black oaks near the shed weren't close enough for their branches to reach the roof. A person. The shed stood on a small rise with its sloped roof, reaching about 12 feet at its highest point. There was no easy way to access it, no ladder, no adjacent trees, nothing. Another heavy step. Whatever had landed remained on the roof. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me. Then another step, slower this time, deliberate. The ceiling creaked directly above my head, as if tracking my position. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood up, the piano bench scraping loudly across the floor, the movement above stilled immediately. Listening. I edged toward the small window, hoping to see a reflection on the roof, but the angle made it impossible. The property backed up to a golf course with a steep 20-foot berm separating us from it. There was simply no way someone could have climbed up there without equipment. A low sound vibrated through the ceiling, not quite a growl, but something deeper, almost subsonic. I felt it more than heard it. That did it. I lunged for the light switch, plunging the shed into darkness. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, unwilling to turn on its flashlight. In the darkness, I could hear more clearly. Heavy breathing from above, the subtle shift of weight on the shingled roof. I crept to the door, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. The doorknob felt ice cold in my sweaty palm. I turned it slowly, then pulled the door open just enough to slip through. The night air hit my face. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the main house's windows glowing warmly in the distance. I took one step out, then another. A heavy thud from behind me, the sound of something dropping from the roof to the ground. I didn't look back. I ran. The 50 yards to the main house became the longest sprint of my life. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut behind me and engaging every lock. "Steve, what's wrong?" My mom appeared from the living room, concern etched on her face. "Nothing," I lied, struggling to catch my breath. Thought I saw a mountain lion near the shed. Probably nothing. That night I lay awake, staring at my ceiling, listening for sounds outside my window. I told myself it was probably just a bobcat that had somehow managed to jump onto the roof, but bobcats don't weigh enough to shake a building. Mountain lions are heavier, but they don't hang around human structures like that. I never told anyone the full story. What would I say? Something impossible landed on my roof. I'd sound crazy. 5 years passed. I moved to San Francisco, formed a band, started building a life away from those Marin County hills. I mostly forgot about that night, filing it away as one of those unexplainable events you eventually stop trying to explain. Then came the night everything changed. We'd just finished a set at a small club in the Mission District. My bandmate Freeman Young and I sat at the bar, nursing beers and discussing the performance. "That new bridge in the third song needs work," Freeman said, picking at the label on his bottle. "But the crowd dug it." I nodded, watching the condensation drip down my glass. "We'll tighten it up at practice." Freeman fell quiet, staring into his beer with unusual intensity. "What's up?" I asked. He glanced around, making sure no one was listening closely. "You grew up in Mill Valley, right? Near that golf course?" "Yeah, my parents still live there." "Why?" He took a long pull from his beer. "I never told you this, but I had the weirdest thing happen to me back in high school about 6 years ago. I was walking along that retaining wall that runs behind your neighborhood." My skin prickled. "The one by the golf course?" "Yeah. It was around dusk. I was taking a shortcut to my buddy's house." Freeman leaned closer. "I was walking along the top of that wall. You know it's like 14, 16 feet high on the neighborhood side, right?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "So I'm walking, checking messages on my phone, when I hear this weird sound, like a huff of breath. I look up and this thing jumps down from somewhere above me, lands right in front of me on the wall. The bar's ambient noise seemed to fade." "What do you mean, thing?" Freeman's eyes met mine, deadly serious. "It looked like a massive baboon, Steve. But we don't have baboons around here, right? It was about 6 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and it hissed at me." My beer glass nearly slipped from my hand. "What did you do?" "What do you think?" I freaked out. Backed away slowly at first, then turned and ran like hell. When I looked back, it was gone. He shook his head. "I never told anyone. Who'd believe me? Some giant ape thing in Mill Valley. They'd think I was drunk or high." The memory of that night in the shed came rushing back, the weight landing on the roof, the deliberate movement, that subsonic growl. "I believe you," I said quietly. Freeman's eyebrows shot up. "You do?" I told him everything then. The piano practice, the sensation of being watched, the impact that shook the entire structure. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting. For years, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the severity of the incident or exaggerated it in my memory. "Sasquatch," Freeman said when I finished. "Has to be." I started to laugh, but it died in my throat. All my life I'd dismissed Bigfoot as a myth, a hoax perpetuated by blurry photos and attention seekers. But sitting there comparing notes with Freeman, I couldn't find an alternative explanation. What else could jump from heights like that? What else had the weight to shake a building? "There's protected land all around there," I said slowly. "Thousands of acres where hunting is prohibited. No development allowed." Freeman nodded. "Perfect place for something to hide." That conversation happened 2 years ago. Since then, I've done research, connected with others who've had similar experiences in Marin County and the surrounding wilderness areas. I'm not some Bigfoot hunter now. I don't tromp through the woods with night vision goggles or set up trail cameras. But I know what I experienced. Last month I visited my parents. The old shed still stands in the backyard, now used for storage. I walked out there one afternoon, unlocked the padlock and stepped inside. The piano was long gone, sold when I moved out. Cardboard boxes and old gardening equipment took its place. I stood in the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling. The beams had been repainted, erasing any evidence of that night. I ran my hand along one, feeling the smooth surface. "I know you were there," I said to the empty room. "I don't know what you are, but I know you were real." The protected lands of Marin County hold many secrets. Mountain lions stalk the underbrush, bobcats hunt in the tall grass, and coyotes yip in the moonlight. But something else moves through those woods too. Something that can leap great distances, something strong enough to shake buildings, something curious enough to investigate piano music drifting through the night air. I don't tell this story often. Most people smile politely and change the subject. Some ask if I'd been drinking or suggest it was probably raccoons. But occasionally, someone nods slowly, a look of recognition crossing their face. They have their own story, a shadow that walked on two legs, an impossible set of footprints, a feeling of being watched by something intelligent. In those moments, I know I'm not crazy. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation, things that exist in the spaces between what we acknowledge and what we dismiss. That night in the shed, I encountered one of them. And now, I finally understand what Freeman meant when he said there was no other practical explanation. Whatever landed on my roof that night wasn't human. It wasn't a known animal. It was something else entirely, something that, for a brief moment, took an interest in a 19-year-old kid playing piano in a backyard shed in the hills of Marin County. And sometimes, when I'm alone practicing music late at night, I still get that feeling, the hair on my neck standing up, that electric sensation of being watched. When it happens, I stop playing, turn off the lights, and wait for the heavy footsteps that never come. Story 8. I settled into my tree stand as the first light of dawn painted the New Jersey forest in pale gray. My breath clouded in the November chill while I adjusted my rifle, scanning the ridgeline. 40 years of hunting these woods should have made me comfortable, but comfort wasn't something I felt out here anymore. Not since I remembered what I'd seen as a boy, and certainly not since I'd seen it again. My name is Marcus Bennett. I'm a high school football coach in Hillcrest, New Jersey. 53 years old, divorced, with grown kids who visit from college when they remember their old man exists. I've been hunting these woods since I was strong enough to pull back a bow. At 6'3" and 240 pounds, I'd never worried much about my safety in the forest. Until recently. The woods had always been my sanctuary. But now every snap of a twig, every shadow at the edge of my vision, every strange silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. Because I knew something was out there. Something that watched me. Something that had been watching me for decades. The first time I saw it, I was 12 years old. My family had taken a trip to California, visiting Muir Woods. I remember my dad pointing out the massive redwoods, my mother fussing with the camera, my sister complaining about the hike, but all I cared about was exploring. While they argued about which trail to take, I slipped away down toward a stream where I'd heard you could spot steelhead trout. The forest was different there, denser, damper, with ferns covering the ground and fog hanging between the trees. I remember the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves as I followed the sound of running water. The stream was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I crouched by the bank, watching for fish, then decided to follow it around a bend to where the water pooled. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a man, someone fishing or getting a drink. It was squatting by the water's edge, its back to me. But something felt wrong. Its proportions weren't quite right, too broad in the shoulders, arms too long. I must have made a sound because suddenly its head whipped around, our eyes locked. I'll never forget those eyes. Dark and intelligent, set in a face that was almost human, but wrong. The nose was flat, the jaw heavy, the brow prominent. and while its body was covered in dark brown hair, parts of its face were hairless, making it look like some terrible halfway point between man and animal. It stood up. God, it stood up fast. 1 second crouching, the next at full height, at least 7 feet tall, muscles bunched under that hair. It stared at me for 3 heartbeats, then it moved. I've seen deer sprint, bears run, but nothing moved like this thing. It cleared the 20-foot creek in a single bound, landing on my side. I ran. I ran so hard my lungs burned, crashing through ferns and branches until I found my family. I was hysterical, but no one believed me. Dad said it was probably just a homeless person or another hiker who I'd startled. For years, I convinced myself he was right. I buried the memory, explained it away. Just my imagination, just a strange man in the woods. I moved on, fast forward to 2000. I was 40 years old, settled in Hillcrest with a teaching job and my coaching position. It was November, right after a Friday night football game. We'd won, and I should have been celebrating with the team. But all I could think about was getting into the woods for the last few hours of daylight. Bow season was almost over, and I hadn't filled my tag. I changed quickly, grabbed my compound bow from my truck, and headed to my favorite spot. The adrenaline from the game was still pumping through me as I climbed into my stand. It wasn't long before a decent 8-point buck appeared. I took the shot, a clean hit through the lungs. The deer bolted, and I heard it crash about 50 yards in. I waited the obligatory 30 minutes before climbing down to track it. There was a good blood trail, bright red with bubbles, telling me I'd hit the lungs. I followed it easily for about 150 yards, expecting to find the buck around every tree. Instead, I found something that stopped me cold. There was a circular area about 10 feet in diameter, completely saturated with blood and hair. Blood spattered on the surrounding trees, more blood than a single deer should hold. Tufts of deer hide scattered across leaves. But no deer, no body, not even bones. I searched the area for drag marks, thinking maybe a pack of coyotes had already found my kill. Nothing, just my carbon arrow broken into tiny pieces, scattered like someone had deliberately snapped it apart. The sun was setting fast, and a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature washed over me. I headed back to my truck, walking faster than necessary, feeling eyes on my back the whole way. That winter passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. Spring arrived, and with it, turkey season. I had a good spot near a swamp at the base of a ridge behind my property. For the first few mornings, everything was normal, except for one thing. I kept finding unusually large tracks at the edge of the swamp. Bear, I told myself. Just a big black bear. But bears don't make me nervous. This did. One morning in late April, I arrived at my spot later than usual. The sun was already peeking over the horizon as I set up my turkey decoys. That's when I heard it, a hooting sound like an owl, but not quite right. The cadence was off, the pitch a little lower than any owl I'd ever heard. I froze, listening. The sound came again, followed by something else. Footsteps. Not the shuffling of a bear through leaves, but the distinct sound of something walking upright. 2 feet, not 4, moving with purpose. I raised my shotgun instinctively, peering through the early morning mist toward the sound. The footsteps picked up pace, becoming a run. Something was charging toward the ridge, fast, impossibly fast. I caught only glimpses through the trees, a tall, dark shape moving with fluid speed. It hit the steep incline of the ridge and didn't slow down, taking the hill in enormous strides that no human could match. At the top of the ridge, it paused. It turned, and I saw the face. The same face that had haunted my childhood nightmares. Older now, just as I was, but unmistakable. Those eyes locked onto mine across 200 yards of forest, and I knew it recognized me too. Recognition from an impossible creature. Then it was gone, disappearing over the ridge in seconds. I didn't hunt that day. I went home, hands shaking so badly I could barely start my truck. Because now I remembered. Now I knew that what I'd seen in California wasn't a homeless man or a fellow hiker. And whatever it was here in New Jersey. It had found me. Or maybe I had unknowingly found it. The incidents escalated after that. 2 weeks later, I shot another buck during an evening hunt. I field dressed it by my truck, loaded it into the bed, and went back to grab my gear. I was gone less than 5 minutes. When I returned, the deer was gone, lifted cleanly out of my pickup. No blood trail, no drag marks. I started hearing that owl call that wasn't an owl whenever I hunted, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always followed by the sensation of being watched. Once walking back to my truck after dark, my headlamp caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me from about 50 yards away, standing height over 7 feet off the ground. They didn't move or blink, just watched as I hurried past. Last fall, I was bow hunting from a ground blind when I heard something circling my position. Slow, deliberate steps, pausing occasionally, then continuing. For 2 hours, it paced around me, never showing itself, never making any sound besides those footsteps. When I finally left at dark, I found branches broken at head height, all around my blind in a perfect circle, fresh breaks that hadn't been there when I arrived. I've seen others since then. They're not all the same. Some larger, some smaller. Once, in the middle of a snowstorm, I saw 3 sets of tracks crossing my property, all bipedal, all with 5 toes, but ranging from the size of a large man's boot to prints nearly 16 inches long. I still hunt these woods. I still fish the streams. I'm not going to let fear drive me away from what I love, but I hunt differently now. I'm alert in a way I never was before. I carry a sidearm along with my hunting weapon. I tell someone where I'm going and when I'll be back. Small precautions that probably wouldn't matter if they decided to do to me what they did to that buck. Because that's the thing. They could have hurt me any time they wanted. The one on the ridge could have charged down the hill instead of up. The one circling my blind could have attacked instead of marking trees. Whatever took the deer from my truck could have waited for me to return. They're playing with me, letting me know I'm in their territory, reminding me of my place in these woods. Last month, I was sitting on my back porch having a beer, looking out at the tree line as the sun set. A movement caught my eye, something large, stepping partly out from behind a thick oak about 80 yards from my house. It stood there, half hidden, watching me. I raised my hand, a cautious greeting or acknowledgement. It didn't move for a long moment, then its arm lifted, mirroring my gesture, before it melted back into the forest. Communication, recognition, intelligence in those eyes that's unmistakable. That's what scares me the most. These aren't animals acting on instinct. They know what they're doing. They recognize me specifically. They remember me from California 40 years ago. They know where I live. They know my routines. I've heard stories since then. Other hunters in the area who've had deer stolen right after the kill. Strange sounds in the night. Missing pets near the edge of the woods. Most people blame bears or coyotes or mountain lions. I know better. I'm not some crackpot. I don't believe in aliens or the paranormal. I'm a science teacher, for God's sake. But I know what I've seen, what I continue to see. There's something in these woods that science hasn't classified, that most people will never encounter, and that those who do see won't be believed. I used to think I was the apex predator when I entered the forest. I know better now. I'm tolerated, allowed, perhaps even respected in some strange way, but never safe. These creatures could snap my neck or twist my head off like a beer bottle cap if they wanted to. The woods aren't mine. They never were. I'm just a visitor here, and not the first human to realize that. But I've made my peace with it. I still hunt, I still hike. I just do it knowing I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I hear that fake owl call echo through the trees, I hoot back, just to let them know I understand the rules of this strange game we're playing. Yesterday, I found a freshly killed rabbit on my porch steps. No tooth marks, no signs of predation. Just a clean kill, placed deliberately where I would find it. A gift? A warning? I don't know. But tonight I'm going back into the woods, because whatever these creatures are, they're part of my life now. And in some twisted way, I'm part of theirs. I just have to remember my place. I have to remember that out here in the dense forests of northern New Jersey, I'm not the hunter anymore. Not really. I'm just another creature in the woods, being watched by eyes older and wilder than anything I was ever taught to believe in. Story 9. My hands shake as I set down my coffee mug. Even now, 18 years later, I can't talk about that October night without my heart hammering against my ribs. Some things just don't fit into the neat boxes we build for our world. I was 51 then, with 20 years of police work behind me and combat tours before that. I'd seen plenty, thought I knew fear, thought wrong. My name is James Wilson. I grew up in Hocking County, Ohio, where the hills roll thick with oak and maple, where every boy learns to track deer before he learns algebra. I knew those woods, every animal, every trail, every sound. At least I thought I did. That day started like any other hunting trip. October 27th, perfect weather. Cool enough for deer to move, warm enough to sit comfortably. I packed my truck before dawn, Remington 30-06, extra rounds, thermos of coffee, sandwich, apple, knife, standard kit. I drove out to private land I had permission to hunt, bordered by the Hocking National Forest on one side and the County Correctional Facility on the other. The property owner, Earl Dawkins, had given me access years ago. "Just don't shoot toward the prison," he'd joked. "Paperwork's a nightmare." I parked where the gravel road ended and hiked in a quarter mile to my favorite spot, a natural blind at the base of a limestone rock wall that rose about 30 feet straight up. Perfect position. The wall behind me, thick brush on either side, and a clear view of a major deer trail that crossed 20 yards in front. I'd taken 3 bucks from this same spot over the years. I settled in around 3 in the afternoon, expecting the deer to move at dusk. The woods smelled of fallen leaves and damp earth. A crow called somewhere to my right. Normal. Everything was normal. For the first couple hours, I just watched. A few squirrels chattered overhead. A raccoon ambled across the trail around 4:30. No deer yet, but that wasn't unusual. They'd come when the light faded. Around 5, I felt something hit my shoulder. An acorn. Then another bounced off my hat. Squirrels, dropping them, I figured. Happens all the time. I glanced up but didn't see anything through the branches. The sun set behind the hills. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. This was prime time. When the big bucks move, I leaned forward, rifle across my knees, scanning the trail. Nothing showed. By 6:30, full darkness had settled in. No deer. It happens. Some days they just don't come through. I decided to pack it in. From my spot, I could see the security light at the edge of Earl's property, about a quarter mile away. That light would guide me back to my truck. I stood, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and took one last look around. Still nothing, just the normal night sounds of the forest. Crickets, an occasional owl. I started walking, following the faint path I knew led back to the road. I'd gotten maybe 30 yards when it happened. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. A massive impact behind me. Thud. The ground actually shook. My first thought, a tree fell. But there was no crack of breaking wood, no rustle of branches, just that single heavy thud. I froze, turned slowly back toward the rock wall. That's when I heard the breathing. Deep, powerful breaths. In, out, in, out. Not human breathing. Too deep, too powerful. Not a deer or bear either. I'd heard both plenty of times. This was different. The security light seemed miles away now, a distant speck of yellow in the pitch black. My night vision was shot from looking at it. The darkness between me and the rock wall was absolute. Then came the sound, started like a deer's warning, that forceful exhale they make when alarmed. But this went on too long, too loud. The The sound vibrated through my chest like standing in front of a bass speaker. My skin prickled all over. My brain raced through possibilities. Black bear? Too tall. The breathing came from higher than a bear would stand. Mountain lion? Wrong sound entirely, and neither could make that jump. 30 feet straight down. 2 heartbeats passed. Then it took a step toward me. The ground crunched under its weight. Another step. I ran. No shame in admitting it. 20 years wearing a badge, combat tours in desert countries, and I flat out ran. Blind panic. The only thought in my head, get to the light. The forest was pitch black. I couldn't see the ground, couldn't see anything. Just ran toward that distant security light, crashing through brush, tripping over roots and fallen logs. I fell hard the first time, scrambled up quickly. Behind me I heard it moving, not running. Walking, steady, deliberate, following. I fell again, this time over a fallen tree. My rifle strap caught on something. I yanked it free and kept going. The third time I fell, I slid down a small embankment, mud coating my hands and face. Each time I went down, the footsteps behind me stopped, waited, then started again when I got up. It was playing with me. That realization hit harder than any fall. Whatever this thing was, it could have caught me at any point. It was tracking me, not hunting me. Not yet. The fourth time I fell, I lost my hat. Didn't matter. The fifth time, I tore my pants at the knee, felt blood trickle down my leg. Didn't matter either. Nothing mattered except reaching that light. When I finally broke through the tree line into the small clearing where the security light stood on its pole, I was gasping for air, covered in mud and sweat. I pressed my back against the metal pole, raised my rifle, and aimed back toward the trees. Nothing emerged, just darkness and silence. Then, movement to my left, not directly in front, but off at an angle, maybe 40 degrees. I swung the rifle that way, finger tight on the trigger. 2 eyes reflected the security light, not at human height, higher, 6 feet at least. They blinked once, very slowly. I could make out no shape, no body, just those eyes, glowing with reflected yellow light. For 3 seconds we stared at each other. My rifle barrel shook. The eyes didn't move. Then they turned away. I heard footsteps, heavy but surprisingly quiet, moving back up the hillside, back toward the rock wall. The sound faded gradually until all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there for 20 minutes, back against that pole, gun raised. Nothing came back. Eventually, I sidestepped around the clearing, keeping the light at my back until I reached the gravel road. I half ran, half walked to my truck, jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away with the window down, still holding my rifle ready in my right hand. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in my living room with every light on, cleaning my mud-caked rifle over and over. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a bear. Had to be. My mind playing tricks in the dark. But I knew better. Bears don't jump 30 feet down from rock walls. Bears don't track you just to see you run. Bears don't stand 6 feet tall on an incline and stare at you with intelligent eyes. I called Earl the next day. "You ever hear anything strange up in those woods?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Strange how?" Earl was 70 then, lived on that land his whole life. "I don't know. Just unusual. Big. Something that might make a hell of a racket." Earl was quiet for a long time. "You see something up there, Jimmy?" "Not exactly." "Heard something. Big. Followed me back to the property line." More silence. Then, "My granddaddy used to tell stories. Said there was something in those hills, something that was there before white folks came. Before the Shawnee even. Said it marked its territory on the rock walls." "What was it?" "He never said. Just called it the Walker. Said it didn't bother folks who respected the land." I never went back to that hunting spot. Found new places. Told people I was just switching things up. But the truth is, I couldn't make myself walk back into those trees. Couldn't face that rock wall again. For months after, I had the same dream, running through black woods, falling, getting up, knowing something was behind me, something that could catch me any time it wanted. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing. The dreams come less often now, 18 years later, maybe once every couple months instead of every night. But they still come. I've heard stories since then, hikers in the national forest reporting strange sounds at night, a correctional officer who quit after seeing something watching from the tree line during his night shift, 2 college kids who went camping near the rock wall and came back babbling about footprints bigger than dinner plates. People dismiss them, blame bears or wild hogs or overactive imaginations. That's easier than the alternative. I've never told the full story until now. Who would believe an old cop's tale about something impossible in the Ohio woods? But I know what I experienced. I know what followed me that night. I know what stood at the edge of the light and decided, for whatever reason, to let me go. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, walking those hills, watching from rock walls as people pass below. I wonder if it remembers me. I wonder if it's watching others the way it watched me. I keep my doors locked at night now. I don't hike after dark. And when acorns fall on my roof during autumn storms, I lie awake, listening for the sound of heavy breathing outside my window. Because the thing that hunts in Hocking County is patient. And I can't shake the feeling that our game of chase isn't over, just paused. Sleep doesn't come easy these days, not in October, not when the leaves turn and fall. Not when the darkness comes early, because some things that live in the dark don't belong in any world we understand. And once you've heard them breathe, you never forget the sound. Story 10. The chains rattled in my gloved hands as I stepped out of the truck cab. The temperature had dropped to 15 below, and my breath clouded in front of my face. I'd made this run hundreds of times before, Anchorage to Fairbanks and back, hauling everything from produce to construction materials across Alaska's unforgiving terrain. Tonight was different only because I had company. Mike Lawson, fresh out of trucking school, eager and green as spring grass. "Watch your step," I called to him as he climbed down on the passenger side. Ice everywhere tonight. The digital clock on the dash read 2:07 a.m. We'd pulled over just outside Soldotna at the bottom of a steep grade that demanded chains in these conditions. The highway stretched empty in both directions, our headlights the only interruption in the darkness. To our right stood a boat sales yard, closed for the season, its vessels shrouded in white tarps like ghosts in the night. "We'll chain up both trailers," I explained to Mike. "Then you can take a bathroom break if you need it. There's nothing for another 60 miles after this." Mike nodded, his face barely visible beneath his thick winter hat. "Sounds good, Mr. Hargrove. Just David is fine." I bent down and started unloading the chains from the side compartment. The metal links bit into my fingers even through the insulated gloves. The work was routine. I could practically do it blindfolded after 15 years on the road. I explained each step to Mike, wanting him to learn properly. "Go ahead and start on the other side," I instructed. "Just like I showed you back at the depot. I'll finish up here." Mike walked around the back of our double trailer. The night pressed in around us, the kind of deep Alaska darkness that swallows sound. I focused on securing the chains to the drive wheels, the familiar task, calming. Just another night on the road. Just another run. Then I heard it. A scream tore through the night. Not an animal sound, not quite human either. It came from Mike's direction, high-pitched and raw with terror. I dropped the chain and bolted upright. "Mike!" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. No answer came back, just ragged breathing. I moved quickly around the truck, boots crunching on frozen gravel. When I reached the other side, I found Mike backed against the trailer, his body rigid. His arm extended straight out, pointing toward the concrete retaining wall that separated the pull-off area from the boatyard. "What the hell?" I started to ask, but the words died in my throat as I followed his gesture. It stood there, partially illuminated by our truck's headlights, 10 feet tall at least, maybe more. The creature's bulk filled the space between two parked boats, its shoulders spanning wider than any man I'd ever seen, 4 feet across, maybe more. Black hair covered its body, long and matted like a bear's winter coat, but the proportions were all wrong. It stood upright on 2 legs, its torso shaped more like a man's than any animal I knew. But the face, God help me, the face, not quite human, not fully animal. Eyes that reflected our lights like a deer's, but larger, set in a face that seemed almost simian, but with a protruding jaw. Its breath steamed in the cold air in great clouding puffs. The most unnatural detail, the one that still wakes me up at night, were its feet. Not paws like a bear, not hands like a gorilla or ape. Hooves, split hooves like a goat or elk, but massive, leaving indentations in the snow that would easily dwarf my spread hand. The creature stood motionless for 3, maybe 4 seconds, regarding us with those reflective eyes. It seemed as startled by our presence as we were by its... Something about its posture, a certain tension in its enormous frame, suggested it was afraid. That thought barely registered before Mike whispered, "David, what is that thing?" His voice, though barely audible, broke the spell. The creature's head swiveled sharply, focusing entirely on us. It made a sound then, not a growl or roar, but a low, humming vibration that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. "Get in the truck," I said, not taking my eyes off the being. "Now!" I grabbed Mike's jacket sleeve and pulled. He stumbled backward, still staring. I yanked harder, breaking his trance, and we both scrambled toward the cab. I pushed him ahead of me, keeping myself between him and the thing by the wall. The creature took a step forward. The ground seemed to shake with its weight. Another step. The humming sound grew louder. I reached the driver's side door and wrenched it open, practically throwing Mike inside before climbing in myself. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the transmission into gear without bothering to finish with the chains. "What was that?" Mike kept repeating, his voice rising in pitch each time. "What was that? What was that?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. My eyes stayed locked on the side mirror as we pulled away. The creature stood at the edge of the pavement now, watching us leave. In the red glow of our taillights, it looked like something torn from a nightmare, not of this world, not of any world I understood. We drove in silence for 20 miles before either of us spoke again. The chains I'd managed to put on the first trailer clanked rhythmically against the pavement, an incongruous normality after what we'd witnessed. "We need to report it," Mike finally said. I barked out a laugh that held no humor. "Report what? To who?" "That we saw Bigfoot with goat feet. They'll drug test us both." "It wasn't Bigfoot," Mike insisted. "It was something else." Exactly my point. We stopped at a 24-hour gas station in the next town. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes after the darkness of the highway, but I welcomed the pain. It anchored me to reality, to the world I knew before tonight. Mike went to the bathroom while I called our dispatcher to report a delay due to wildlife on the road. Not a lie, not exactly. We completed the run to Fairbanks in silence. Mike asked for a transfer the next day. I didn't blame him. I should have done the same, but I didn't. I convinced myself it had been a bear standing upright, or maybe a moose in strange lighting. The human mind plays tricks, everyone knows that. So I kept driving, kept making the same runs. But something had changed inside me. I flinched at shadows on the road. I stopped taking night shifts when possible. When forced to drive after dark, I kept the cabin lights on despite how it affected my night vision. Better to see less of the road than more of what might be beside it. 3 weeks after the incident, I was back near Soldotna. Daylight run this time, sun bright on the snow. I passed the boatyard without slowing, but my eyes were drawn to that concrete wall. Nothing there, of course, just dirty snow and winter shadows. That night in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind became that humming vibration in my memory. I got up and turned on all the lights, checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains shut tight. By month 2, my supervisor called me into his office. "David, your logs show you're refusing night runs," he said, folder open on his desk. "That's half our business. What's going on?" I considered telling him the truth, then imagined the look that would cross his face. "Just having some vision problems after dark," I lied. "Seeing an eye doctor next week." He nodded, concern evident. "Get it checked out. We need you back on the full schedule by next month." I never made it to next month. 4 days later, I was driving through Thompson Pass at dusk when the sun dipped below the mountains. The shadows stretched across the road, and panic seized my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't focus. I pulled over, hazards blinking, and sat gripping the wheel while sweat poured down my back despite the cold. A state trooper found me there an hour later, still frozen in place. He called it an anxiety attack. I called it my last day as a truck driver. I quit the next morning. 15 years on the road, ended by a single night in Soldotna. The weeks that followed blur together in my memory. I returned to my small house outside Wasilla and barely left it. The woods behind my property, once a comfort, became threatening. I installed motion sensor lights all around the perimeter, then a fence, then cameras. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, always with the lights on. My electric bill tripled. I didn't care. Old friends called, stopped calling when I refused to see them. My sister Jenny drove up from Anchorage, concerned by my sudden resignation and withdrawal. "This isn't like you, David," she said, standing in my living room, taking in the newspaper-covered windows, the monitors showing feeds from the outdoor cameras. "What happened out there?" I almost told her. The words rose to my lips, about the creature, about the hooves, about the inhuman sound it made. But I swallowed them back. "Just burned out," I said instead. "Needed a change." She didn't believe me, left after making me promise to see a doctor. I made an appointment to appease her, then cancelled it the next day. What would I say? That I was afraid of the dark now? That I couldn't look at the woods without imagining something watching me from between the trees? 4 months after quitting driving, money got tight. I found work at a hardware store in Wasilla. Day shifts only. The manager, Bill Thorne, was an old friend who didn't ask questions when I specified no late closes. The routine helped. Wake up, work, home before dark, lock everything, check cameras, try to sleep, repeat. Then winter came again, and with it the long Alaska nights. Darkness by 3 p.m. meant finishing my shifts in black skies. Each walk to my truck in the parking lot became an exercise in controlled terror. I'd scan the tree line at the edge of the lot, keys gripped between my fingers like makeshift brass knuckles. On December 12th, almost exactly 1 year after the incident, I was restocking shelves when Bill approached me. "David, I need you to take a delivery out to the Richardson place," he said. "Their generator's down, and they've got young kids out there." The Richardson farm lay 10 miles outside town, down an unlit country road. I started shaking my head before he finished speaking. "Can't Casey do it?" I asked, naming our youngest employee. "He's out sick. Look, I know you don't like driving after dark, but it's an emergency. They've got no heat." I looked at my watch. 4:17 p.m. Already full dark outside for hours. "I can't," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. Bill's expression hardened slightly. "David, it's been a year of this. Whatever's going on with you, you need to deal with it. These are good people who need help." Shame washed over me. A year of looking over my shoulder, a year of jumping at shadows. And for what? I hadn't seen the creature again. I hadn't heard of anyone else encountering anything similar. Maybe Mike and I had shared some bizarre hallucination. Maybe it had been exactly what I told myself, a bear or moose in strange lighting. "Okay," I said finally, "I'll take it out there." Bill clapped my shoulder. "Good man, take my truck. The generator's already loaded in the back." 20 minutes later, I was driving down County Road 8, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The headlights cut a narrow path through absolute darkness. Trees pressed close on both sides of the road, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers over the pavement. I turned on the radio to drown out my thoughts. Country music filled the cab, some singer lamenting lost love, better than the silence. 5 miles out of town, the music stuttered, then dissolved into static. I fiddled with the dial, but every station produced the same white noise. I switched it off, and the silence pressed in heavier than before. I was approaching the turnoff to the Richardson place when I saw it. Just a flash in my peripheral vision, movement in the trees to my right. I jerked my head to look, but there was nothing there, just darkness between trunks. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, turning onto the gravel drive that led to the Richardson farm. The truck's headlights bounced over the uneven surface, creating jumping shadows that my mind transformed into crouching figures, into watching eyes. The farmhouse appeared ahead, windows glowing with what must have been emergency lanterns. I pulled up to the front porch and cut the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. The porch light cast a small circle of yellow, but beyond it, the darkness seemed absolute. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and snow. I stepped out, boots crunching on frozen gravel. "Mr. Richardson," I called out, "delivery from Thorne's Hardware." The front door opened, spilling more light onto the porch. A man stepped out, middle-aged, bearded, wearing a heavy flannel shirt. "Thank God," he said. "Kids are freezing in here. Let me help you with that generator." We unloaded the machine together, and I walked him through the startup procedure. His gratitude was evident in every "thank you" and "we really appreciate this." I felt my shame returning. These were the consequences of fear. People suffering because I couldn't face the dark. "You need anything else before I head back?" I asked when we finished. He shook his head. "This is life-saving enough. Drive safe now. Roads get tricky out here at night." I nodded and returned to the truck. As I backed up to turn around, my headlights swept across the edge of their property where field met forest. For an instant, just an instant, I thought I saw something move between the trees, tall, dark, watching. My foot slammed the brake pedal. The truck jerked to a halt. "Not real," I whispered. "Not there." I forced myself to stare at the tree line. Nothing moved. No goat-hooved monster, no 10-foot shadow, just winter-bare trees and darkness. Slowly, I completed my turn and headed back down the driveway. My heart thundered in my chest, but I kept my eyes forward, focused on the road ahead. I wouldn't let the fear win. Not tonight. The drive back to town passed without incident. Each mile that disappeared behind me loosened the knot in my stomach a fraction. By the time I pulled into the hardware store parking lot, I was almost calm. Bill waited by the entrance, locking up. He raised a hand in greeting as I parked. "Got it delivered?" he asked as I approached. "All set up and running," I confirmed. They were grateful. He nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Knew you could handle it. Want to grab a beer?" "I'm buying." I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a bright, crowded bar, surrounded by normal people doing normal things, held appeal. But the clock on my phone showed 6:42 p.m. Hours of darkness still lay between now and dawn. "Rain check?" I offered. "I'm pretty wiped out." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. "Sure thing. See you tomorrow." I drove home slowly, hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement at the edge of my vision. The roads were nearly empty this time of night, especially on the outskirts of town where I lived. When I finally turned onto my street, relief flooded through me. My house stood dark. I'd forgotten to leave lights on. No matter, I had the routine down to seconds. Car to front door in 12 steps, key in lock. Inside, all lights on, doors locked, cameras checked. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The silence that followed seemed louder than any noise. I grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and opened the car door. The motion sensor lights didn't come on. I froze, one foot on the ground, the other still in the car. The lights always came on. I'd tested them just yesterday. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a shifting of shadows by the edge of my property, where my yard met the tree line. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But the motion lights still didn't activate. I pulled my foot back into the car and closed the door. With trembling fingers, I turned the key again, bringing the engine to life. The headlights illuminated my front yard, the path to my door, the edge of the woods. Nothing there, nothing visible. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove straight to the Moose Creek Motel on the highway. I paid for a room with cash, drew the curtains tight, turned on every light, and sat on the bed with my back against the headboard until morning broke. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to my house, called in sick to work for a week, then quit over the phone. Bill tried to talk me out of it, but I couldn't explain. Couldn't tell him that the thing from Soldotna had found me, that it had followed me, that it was waiting. I'm writing this from a new apartment in Juneau, as far from Soldotna as I could get without leaving Alaska altogether. The nightmares still come every night. In them, I'm back at that pull-off area, watching the creature emerge from between the boats. But in the dreams it speaks, says my name in that humming vibration that rattles my bones, says it's been looking for me. I keep the lights on here too. Check the locks twice before sitting down. Flinch at unexpected sounds. But sometimes, in the stillness of 2 a.m., when sleep won't come, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed that night. If I'd gotten out of the car despite the darkness. If I'd walked toward the trees instead of away from them. I wonder if it's still waiting for me there, at the edge of the woods, watching my empty house with patient, reflective eyes. I wonder if I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder. Story 11. I remember that day in 2012 like it was yesterday. The doctor's voice had a practiced neutrality as he said, "Stage 4, Mr. Porter." He laid out the statistics, the treatment options, the quality of life considerations, as he called them. I sat there in that sterile exam room with its antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. 6 months to a year, he said, maybe 2 with aggressive treatment. I was 48 years old. My tech consulting firm in Baltimore was finally turning serious profit after years of grinding. I had a corner office with a view of the harbor. I had a Mercedes in the garage of my Towson home. I had everything except time. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my sister in Ohio, not my ex-wife, not even Bobby, who'd been my best friend since college. I couldn't bear their pity. Instead, I liquidated everything. Sold the business to my partners for less than market value in exchange for speed and discretion. Sold the house, packed what mattered into my Jeep Wrangler, and headed west into the mountains. 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I signed papers on a foreclosed cabin on the eastern edge of the Appalachians. The real estate agent, a local woman named Darlene, warned me about the isolation. "Nearest neighbors 4 miles that-a-way," she said, pointing through the trees. "Town's 22 miles down the mountain. Cell service is spotty. You sure about this, Mr. Porter?" I was. The cabin sat on 13 acres bordered by national forest land. The previous owners had gone broke trying to renovate it, leaving behind half-finished projects. But the bones were good. 2 bedrooms, living area with a stone fireplace, kitchen with propane appliances, and a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A separate workshop stood about 30 yards from the main cabin, connected by a wooden ramp. Below the property, maybe 150 yards through the woods, a creek ran year-round. I paid cash. Moved in that same day with my cat, Freya. A big Norwegian forest cat I'd had for 6 years. She adapted faster than I did, immediately claiming the window seat in the living room where sunlight pooled in the afternoons. For the first month, I focused on repairs, fixed the leaky roof, reinforced the porch railings, installed a more efficient wood stove to supplement the electric heat, connected a generator for backup power, added a cat door from the kitchen to the screened porch so Freya could enjoy the mountain air without wandering off. My body felt better in the mountains. The pain in my side that had driven me to the doctor in the first place seemed to lessen. I stopped taking the pills they'd prescribed, started chopping my own firewood, planted a small vegetable garden, stocked the pantry with supplies that would last months. By fall, I'd stopped checking my phone for messages. I slept better than I had in years, lulled by the chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. When the first snow fell in November, I sat on the porch with Freya in my lap, watching the flakes disappear into the darkness beyond my lantern light. I thought I might die peacefully here. I was okay with that. Then came January, and the first strange occurrence. I was walking back from the creek around dusk, carrying a bucket of water I'd collected for some houseplants when I saw it. A glowing orb, maybe 30 feet above the tree line, perfectly round and pulsing with orange light. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from the setting sun hitting something metallic in the trees, but the sun had already dipped below the ridge. The orb hovered, moved slightly to the left, then right, then vanished. I stood there, bucket in hand, for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing reappeared. I told myself it was probably a weather balloon or some kind of drone from the Forestry Service. 2 weeks later, I saw another one. This time it was early morning, just before sunrise. I was on the porch with my coffee when a bright blue-white orb, smaller than the first, zipped across the sky above my property. It moved too fast and erratically to be a plane or helicopter, stopping abruptly before shooting straight up and disappearing. I might have convinced myself I was hallucinating from isolation if Bobby hadn't seen one too. He drove up from Richmond in April for a weekend visit, our first since I'd moved to the mountains. "Jesus, Mike," he said when he first saw me, "you look healthy." I knew what he meant. When I'd left Baltimore, I was pale, 15 pounds underweight, with dark circles under my eyes. Now I had color in my face, muscle from daily chores, and a full beard I'd grown through the winter. "Mountain living agrees with me," I said, not mentioning my abandoned treatment plan or the fact that I'd stopped keeping track of my presumed expiration date. We were grilling steaks that night when rain started falling, a sudden spring downpour. We ran down to move his car under the carport by the workshop. That's when we both saw it. An orange orb the size of a beach ball, hovering about 6 feet above the small fishing pond I'd cleared near the property line. "What the hell is that?" Bobby asked, stopping in his tracks. The orb pulsed, grew slightly brighter, then dimmer. Water passed straight through it as the rain fell. "I've seen them before," I said. "Never this close." I had my keys in my pocket. "Get in the Jeep." We climbed in and I started the engine, flipping on the high beams as I steered toward the pond. The orb remained stationary as we approached, until we got within about 30 feet. Then it blinked out, not fading, not moving away, just instantaneously gone. "That wasn't a drone," Bobby said. His voice was quiet, tense. "That wasn't anything I've ever seen." "Welcome to Dark Hollow," I said, using the local name for this part of the mountains that I'd learned from Darlene. Bobby left the next day, earlier than planned, mumbling about work. He called once after that, asking if I'd seen more lights, but our conversation was strained. We haven't spoken since. The orbs appeared twice more over the summer, always at a distance, always briefly. I began keeping a journal, noting times and weather conditions, but found no pattern. Then came October, and everything changed. I'd spent the day splitting and stacking firewood, preparing for winter. As dusk approached, I fired up the outdoor wood stove, a cast-iron behemoth left by previous owners that I'd restored. I threw on a thick ribeye, opened a beer, and enjoyed the cool evening air. Leaves crunched somewhere in the woods, not unusual, given the deer, raccoons, and occasional black bear that frequented the area. After eating, I locked up, checked that Freya had food and water, and went to bed around 10:30. The bedroom windows were cracked open, letting in the crisp autumn air. The clock read 12:45 a.m. when Freya woke me. She was standing on my chest, her fur puffed out, tail bushy, eyes wide. She made a sound I'd never heard before, not a hiss or a growl, but a low, urgent vocalization that raised the hair on my arms. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, instantly alert. She jumped off the bed and ran to the bedroom door, looking back at me expectantly. I pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand, and followed her to the kitchen. She was pacing frantically in front of her cat door, which led to the screened porch. I clicked on the flashlight, opened the door to the porch, and Freya immediately slammed herself against my legs, blocking my path. She repeated this 3 times, running a few feet into the room, then charging back to body-check me, as if trying to herd me back inside. That's when I heard it. Something was moving in the woods beyond the porch, something big, not the shuffling of a bear or the graceful steps of a deer. This was heavy, deliberate movement accompanied by a sound I can only describe as wooden knocking, sharp, percussive sounds that echoed through the trees. Bang! Pause. Bang! Bang! I swept my flashlight across the tree line, but saw nothing. The beam didn't reach far enough into the dense woods. The knocking continued, moving parallel to the cabin, accompanied by the snap and crack of breaking branches, not small twigs, but sounds like saplings being snapped in half. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in seconds. My breath fogged in front of me. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling sound that I felt more than heard, vibrating in my chest cavity. Freya howled, a sound of pure terror, and bolted back through her cat door. I followed, slamming and locking the door behind me. Whatever was out there, my cat's reaction told me everything I needed to know. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every light in the cabin burning, my old hunting knife on the coffee table beside me. Freya refused to come out from under the couch until dawn broke. At first light, I ventured outside, circling the cabin cautiously. Nothing seemed disturbed until I reached the ramp leading to my workshop. There, perfectly centered on the wooden planks, was a pile of scat unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was enormous, larger than a dinner plate, and fresh. Steam still rose from it in the cool morning air. The composition was primarily plant matter, but what caught my attention were the seeds, dozens of them undigested, some the size of my thumb. I took photos with my phone, then used a stick to examine it more closely. The fibers appeared to be from plants I didn't recognize, certainly nothing that grew in my garden. I'm not a biologist, but I've hunted enough to know bear scat when I see it. This wasn't from a bear. It wasn't from any animal native to these mountains that I knew of. It rained for the next 3 days, heavy autumn downpours that washed away the evidence. I tried to convince myself it had been a bear, an unusually large one with strange dietary habits. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then, while exploring a rarely used Forest Service road about 4 miles from my cabin, I came across something that stopped me cold. 3 young trees, each about 6 inches in diameter, had been woven together in a complex pattern about 8 feet off the ground, creating a structure that couldn't possibly have occurred naturally. The trees were still alive, still growing, but had been manipulated with significant force, their trunks twisted and intertwined. A quarter-mile further, I found an uprooted pine tree, about 15 feet long, inverted and jammed into the ground so that its root system pointed skyward. The roots had been stripped clean, giving the whole thing the appearance of a giant wooden spear. I turned the Jeep around and drove home, checking my rearview mirror the entire way. That night, I pulled out the footlocker I kept under my bed. Inside was the Mossberg shotgun I'd inherited from my father. Maryland had strict firearms laws, and I'd sold most of my guns before moving, but I'd kept this one, properly registered for home defense. I loaded it and propped it by the front door. Since then, I've established routines. I don't venture into the woods after 4 p.m. I've installed motion-activated floodlights around the cabin perimeter. I keep the shotgun within reach at all times. The orbs still appear occasionally, hovering at the tree line. Sometimes they blink in patterns that seem almost deliberate. I've started flashing my porch lights in response. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 more. Once an orb responded with the exact same pattern. I haven't heard the knocking sounds again. But twice I found similar scat piles, once on my front steps, once by the garden gate. I've seen broken tree limbs 20 feet up that shouldn't be broken. I've found deer carcasses stripped of meat and arranged in ways that defy explanation or natural predation. Something shares these woods with me. Something intelligent. Something large. Something that knows I'm here. The strangest part? My health has improved. The pain is gone completely. My last self-administered check showed no signs of the lumps that were once there. Maybe it's the clean air, the physical work, the spring water. Maybe it's something else. I've been in Dark Hollow for 16 months now. The doctor gave me 12 maximum. I should be dead. Instead, I feel more alive than I have in decades. Sometimes at night, I sit on the porch with Freya and stare into the darkness beyond the reach of my lights. I listen to the forest sounds, the normal ones and the others. I wonder if whatever's out there is watching me too. I'm not leaving. This place saved me somehow, or maybe something in these woods did. The orbs, the unseen visitor, they could have harmed me a dozen times over. Instead, they've kept their distance, watching, occasionally reminding me of their presence. We've established boundaries, this presence and I, a mutual respect perhaps, or maybe it's just waiting. Either way, I'm staying. This hollow is my home now, and I'm no longer afraid to die here. Story 12. First time I saw it, I was just a boy, 10 years old, with my great-grandpappy's 410 shotgun, feeling like the king of Pike Hollow. Second time, I was 35. And that feeling of being king of anything disappeared real quick. I remember that first day clear as if it happened this morning. October 12th, 1985. The leaves had just started turning, painting our corner of Missouri in reds and golds. Grandpa dropped me at the edge of Blackwater Wildlife Management Area at 6 a.m. sharp. The air felt crisp, carrying that sweet decay smell that only autumn in the backwoods brings. Dew soaked my jeans as I pushed through the undergrowth. "I'll pick you up at the North Service Road around 4, Grandpa had said, handing me a paper bag with a sandwich and an apple. "Shoot straight, Teddy." Being out there alone didn't scare me none. Pike Hollow boys learned to hunt before they learned to ride bikes. My great-grandpa's shotgun felt right in my hands, worn smooth wood against my palms, the weight of it like an extension of my arms. I'd been shooting that gun since I was 8, and by 10, I could hit a squirrel at 30 yards without thinking too hard about it. That morning I'd bagged 2 fat fox squirrels and had them tied to my belt, their bodies still warm. Around noon, the sun cut straight down through the canopy, creating patches of light on the forest floor. I sat on a fallen oak to eat my sandwich, the cool October air filling my lungs. I'd just shot a gray squirrel, a nice one too. It dropped clean from a hickory about 20 yards off. I walked over, picked it up by its tail, and was about to add it to the others, when I heard something. A twig snap, then the soft crunch of leaves. I turned around, squirrel still dangling from my hand. Something was walking toward me. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A man, maybe? But as it got closer, I knew that wasn't right. Not a bear either. Wrong shape, wrong movement. It walked on 2 legs, steady and purposeful. I didn't run, didn't holler. Some instinct deeper than fear kept me rooted there, my heart hammering against my ribs. Instead, I did the strangest thing. I raised my squirrel up like I was showing it off. I can't explain why I did that. Just felt like the thing to do. The creature stopped about 15 feet from me, 5 feet tall, maybe a bit less. built thick through the chest and shoulders. Dark, matted hair covered most of its body. Not fur exactly, more like human hair gone wild, tangled with forest debris. Its head had this pointy shape, sloping up gradual-like, not round like yours or mine. The face was dark-skinned, almost black in the dappled forest light. The eyes sat deep in the skull, watching me. Then it opened its mouth. The teeth. Lord, those teeth. Too big, too wide for its face, white and flat and arranged all wrong. We stood there, me and this thing, for what must have been 2 full minutes. It made no sound, didn't come closer, just watched me with those sunken eyes. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing between the trees, moving through the forest like it knew every root and branch by heart. I stayed frozen, squirrel still held up in the air, until I couldn't hear its footsteps anymore. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. The weird thing was, I never felt threatened, scared, sure, but not in danger, and there was no smell. Everyone talks about a stench when they see strange creatures, but this one had no odor at all. When I told Grandpa and Dad later that day, they laughed it off. Probably just old man Wilkins in some crazy hunting gear, Dad said. Or maybe one of those Jackson boys from over the ridge, Grandpa nodded. Likely an older colored fella with some homemade camo. They still hunt these woods the old way sometimes. I knew they were wrong, but I was 10, and 10-year-olds don't win arguments with grown men who've spent their lives in the same forests. So I let it drop, but I never forgot. Life went on. I grew up, worked construction with my dad, got married to my high school sweetheart Ellie, had 2 kids of my own. Every fall I'd go back to Pike Hollow to hunt those same woods, never saw anything strange again. Almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. Almost. Then came October 18th, 2010. I was back in Blackwater, bow hunting for deer. I'd set up my stand about 250 yards from where I'd had my childhood encounter, though I wasn't thinking about that day when I picked the spot. It was just a good location overlooking a game trail that cut between an old cornfield and the dense woods. The afternoon had been quiet. Too warm for good deer movement, around 65 degrees. I'd been in my stand since 2 p.m., and now the sun was starting to sink, maybe 15 minutes before official sundown. That golden hour light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I heard it, movement through the dried corn rows on the field edge, distinct and rhythmic. Not a deer. Deer move through corn with a certain pattern. Stop, go, stop, go. This was steady, deliberate. I nocked an arrow, more out of habit than anything else. The wind had been at my back all evening, blowing from me toward the cornfield. Bad for hunting, but I'd taken the stand anyway. Then the wind shifted, just for a moment, but enough. The sound in the corn stopped dead. I felt it before I heard or saw anything else. The sensation of being watched hit me like a physical blow. The hair on my arms stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my back despite the warm evening. For 10 seconds, I counted them in my head. Something stared at me. I couldn't see it, but I felt its gaze like a drill boring into my skull. My body went electric with a nervous response I can't properly describe, part terror, part recognition. Then it ran. The force of its movement shook the entire row of corn. Whatever it was moved with tremendous speed and power, tearing through the dried stalks like they were nothing. The sound faded as it disappeared into the deeper woods beyond the field. I stayed in my stand until full dark, my bow ready, ears straining for any sound of its return. Nothing came. When I finally climbed down, my legs shook so bad I nearly fell. The walk back to my grandparents' house was the longest quarter-mile of my life. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper than usual. Every snap of a twig made me spin around. My flashlight beam bounced erratically as I half-walked, half-jogged through the familiar forest that suddenly felt alien. I knew something followed me. 20 yards back, keeping pace, never closing the distance, but never falling behind either. I didn't look back, couldn't make myself do it. When I finally saw the yellow lights of my grandparents' porch, I broke into a run. I hunted those same woods hundreds of times over the next decade, never had another incident. But those two encounters stayed with me, vivid in my memory, while other details of my life faded. I never told Ellie or the kids. What would I say? That twice in my life I'd encountered something in the woods I couldn't explain, that would just earn me the same dismissive chuckles I got from Dad and Grandpa. Instead, I started reading. Books on wildlife, local folklore, even online forums where people shared strange experiences. And slowly, I found stories that matched pieces of mine. A maintenance worker in Arkansas described a creature with the same pointed head. A logger in Tennessee mentioned those two wide teeth. A hunter in Kentucky wrote about feeling watched in exactly the way I had. None of the stories matched mine perfectly, but there were enough similarities to make me think I wasn't crazy. Something was out there that science hadn't catalogued or explained. Last fall, I took my son Jeremy hunting in Blackwater for the first time. He's 10 now, the same age I was during my first encounter. As we walked those familiar trails, my eyes kept scanning the tree line, not for deer, but for something else. I found myself hoping he'd see it too, just so I'd know for sure it was real. Then immediately felt guilty for wanting my boy to experience something that had left me questioning my sanity for 35 years. "Dad," Jeremy said as we paused near a creek, "did you ever see anything weird out here? Like, not normal animals?" My heart nearly stopped. "Why do you ask that, son?" He shrugged, looking embarrassed. "I don't know. Just feels like someone's watching us sometimes." I put my hand on his shoulder. "These woods are old, Jeremy. Been here long before people built Pike Hollow, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Sometimes I think they remember everything that's ever happened under these trees." He nodded like that made sense, and we kept walking. I didn't tell him about what I'd seen. Not yet. Maybe someday. Last week, I found an old photograph in Grandpa's hunting journal. After he passed, dated 1943, it showed him as a young man standing by this same creek. In the background, partially hidden by trees, was a dark shape. The image was blurry, the shape indistinct, but I recognized that pointed, sloping head. Grandpa had seen it too, never said a word about it his whole life, just like I'd kept quiet. Makes me wonder how many others in Pike Hollow have their own stories they've never told. I still don't know what it was I saw twice in those woods. Don't know if it was the same creature both times, or if there are more of them. Don't know if they're dangerous or just curious, but I believe those encounters were meant to happen. Strange intersections between my world and something outside it. I'll keep hunting those woods until I can't anymore. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in my stand as the light fades and the forest grows quiet, I find myself hoping for a third encounter. Not out of fear, but because after all these years, I've got some questions of my own. Story 13. I still remember that day, like it was yesterday, not 40 years ago. The rain was coming down in that half-hearted Florida way. Not a downpour, just enough to make everything damp and miserable. Derek and I had just finished up at Mary Lou's store, loading up on groceries and some hardware supplies for the weekend projects he'd been putting off. "Drive slow," I told Derek as we pulled out of the parking lot. "Roads are slick." It was winter in Clewiston, Henry County, 1982 or 83. I can't remember exactly which anymore. Winter in Florida doesn't mean what it does up north, but that day had a chill that cut through my cardigan. The digital clock on our Oldsmobile dashboard read 4:37 p.m., and the sky was already darkening under those heavy clouds. Derek nodded and kept his speed steady as we made our way through Monterey Estates. Not much to see out there in those days, just scattered houses and lots of undeveloped land. Folks who lived out there liked their privacy, acres between neighbors and plenty of woods. We were heading south down Hosand Avenue, windshield wipers squeaking every few seconds, the radio playing some forgotten country tune. "Weather's supposed to clear up tomorrow," Derek said, reaching over to pat my knee. "Could take the kids fishing at the creek." I nodded, only half listening. My attention had drifted to the roadside, where the dense pines and palmettos crowded up near the shoulder. Something about rainy days always made me uneasy, especially out in these parts where the wilderness pressed in close. "Miranda, you listening to me?" Derek asked. That's when I saw it. "Derek, look," I said, sitting up straighter. "There's someone walking up ahead." About 100 yards in front of us, a figure had emerged from the tree line on the right side of the road. It was moving in the same direction we were driving, keeping to the edge of the pavement. Who'd be out walking in this weather? Derek slowed the car a bit more. At first, I thought the same thing. Just some poor soul caught in the rain. Maybe someone whose car broke down, or one of the teenagers from the area taking a shortcut home. But as we got closer, something felt off. They're not carrying an umbrella, I noticed. No raincoat either. The figure was large, tall and broad-shouldered. It walked with a steady gait, not hurrying despite the weather. As we approached, closing the distance between us and the walker, I leaned forward in my seat, squinting through the light drizzle on the windshield. We were about 50 feet away when I got my first clear look. "Derek." My voice caught in my throat. "I see it," he whispered. The thing ahead of us wasn't a person, at least not any kind I'd ever seen before. It stood upright on two legs like a man. But that's where the resemblance ended. Every inch of its body was covered in dark hair, black or maybe very dark brown, hard to tell in the grey afternoon light. The hair wasn't short like an animal's fur. It hung long, 4 to 6 inches at least all over its body. On its head, the hair was even longer, blowing slightly in the damp breeze. Derek had slowed the car to a crawl, and we were nearly alongside it now. The creature stood at least 6 feet tall, taller than Derek, who was 5'11". Its frame was massive, shoulders broad and body thick. I guess it weighed close to 300 pounds, all of its solid bulk. The thing never turned to look at us. It just kept walking, one hairy leg moving in front of the other in a smooth, natural motion. Even its legs were covered in that same long hair, all the way down to where feet should be. I couldn't make out a face, just more dark hair where features should have been. We were approaching our turn onto Hocking Avenue, but neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle patter of rain and the soft rumble of our engine. The creature was now parallel with our car, barely 15 feet away on the roadside. I found myself holding my breath. Derek made the turn mechanically, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. We drove in silence for about 30 seconds before he finally spoke. Was that what I thought it was? My hands were shaking. I don't know what it was. Derek pulled the car over abruptly, tires crunching on the wet gravel shoulder. "We need to go back and look." "Are you crazy?" I asked, but curiosity was already overriding my fear. Derek made a 3-point turn, and we headed back to Hosand Avenue. By the time we reached the spot where we'd seen the creature, there was nothing there. Just empty roadside and the dark line of trees. "Where did it go?" Derek muttered, slowing to a stop. "Something that big can't just disappear." But it had. We drove up and down Hosand Avenue twice, then checked Appalachian Avenue and some of the connecting roads. No sign of the hairy figure anywhere. After 20 minutes of searching, the rain started coming down harder, and Derek finally gave up. "Maybe it went back into the woods," he suggested, though his voice was tight. The drive home was tense and quiet. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hold the outline of that thing. Every dark patch looked like it might be watching us. "What do we tell the kids?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway on Palmetto Street. Derek sighed. "The truth, I guess. we saw something strange. Inside, Tommy and Sarah were arguing over a board game on the living room floor. They looked up when we came in, wet and wide-eyed. "You guys look like you saw a ghost," Tommy said, 13 and already full of that teenage sarcasm. "Not a ghost," Derek said, setting the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, "but something." We told them what we'd seen, the tall, hairy creature walking along Hosand Avenue. Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement, while 10-year-old Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, suddenly afraid. "Like Bigfoot?" Tommy asked eagerly. "I don't know what it was," I admitted. "It walked like a person, but was covered in hair." Sarah's bottom lip quivered. "Is it going to come here?" I regretted saying anything almost immediately. Derek must have felt the same because he quickly backtracked. "You know, it was raining and getting dark," he said casually. "Could have been a tree or something playing tricks on our eyes. Nothing to worry about." "But you said—" Tommy started. "I said we thought we saw something." Derek cut him off firmly. "Probably nothing. Now who's hungry?" That night, after the kids were in bed, Derek and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee gone cold between us. "We know what we saw," I whispered. Derek nodded slowly. "I just don't want the kids having nightmares." "Do you think it was dangerous?" I asked. "It didn't seem interested in us at all," Derek reasoned. "Just walking, minding its own business." "Should we tell someone? The sheriff, maybe?" Derek snorted. "And say what? Hey, Sheriff Benson, we saw a giant hairy man thing walking down Hosand Avenue. He'd think we were drunk or crazy." He was right, of course, so we decided to keep it mostly to ourselves. Derek mentioned it once to his buddy Carl down at the hardware store, who laughed it off as a bear standing on its hind legs. I told my sister Judy, who lived over in Sebring, but she just said the same thing Carl did. It must have been a bear, but I knew better. Bears don't walk upright for hundreds of yards. They don't have hair that hangs 6 inches off their body. They don't move with that smooth, deliberate gait that was so unnervingly human, yet clearly not. For weeks after, I avoided driving down Hosand Avenue. When I needed to go to Mary Lou's store, I'd take the long way around, adding 15 minutes to my trip just to avoid that stretch of road. Derek thought I was being silly, but he never went back that way either. Spring came, then summer, and life went on. The memory remained vivid, but we stopped talking about it. Whenever we drove past that section of road with the kids in the car, Derek and I would exchange a quick glance, but that was all. Years passed. Tommy went off to college in Tallahassee, Sarah got married and moved to Orlando. Derek and I stayed in Clewiston, in the same house on Palmetto Street. Sometimes months would go by without me thinking about what we'd seen that rainy winter day. Then, in 1997, I was at Doreen Miller's place for her garden club meeting. After most of the ladies had left, Doreen, Elaine Parker and I sat on the porch with glasses of sweet tea. Somehow, the conversation turned to local legends. "You remember Old Man Whitaker, who used to have that property out past Monterey Estates?" Elaine asked. I nodded. Everyone knew Raymond Whitaker, a reclusive widower who'd owned about 40 acres off Appalachian Avenue until his death in '89. "My husband helped clear out his place when his nephew inherited it," Elaine continued. "Said Whitaker kept journals, pages and pages about a creature living in the woods behind his house." My tea glass froze halfway to my lips. "What kind of creature?" "Some kind of hairy man-beast," Elaine said, lowering her voice like we were teenagers sharing ghost stories. "Whitaker claimed he'd been leaving food out for it since the '60s, said it was peaceful unless provoked." "That's ridiculous," Doreen scoffed. The old man was probably senile, but my skin had gone cold despite the humid afternoon heat. "Did your husband read any descriptions? What did Whitaker say it looked like?" Elaine shrugged. "Tall, covered in black hair. Walked like a man, but wasn't one. People always thought Whitaker was crazy, talking about his forest friend. The nephew burned all those journals. I never told Elaine or Doreen about what Derek and I had seen. Some things you just keep to yourself, especially in a small town like Clewiston, where talk spreads faster than fire in dry brush. That night I told Derek about Whitaker's journals. Coincidence, he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Besides, that was 15 years ago. Whatever it was is probably long gone. Maybe he was right. But sometimes, especially on rainy winter afternoons when the light starts failing early, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it still out there in the woods of Henry County? Were there more of them? What was it doing on that roadside, and where was it going? Derek died in 2012, heart attack while he was fixing the lawnmower. After the funeral, Tommy tried to convince me to sell the house and move to Tallahassee to be closer to him and his family. "There's nothing keeping you in Clewiston anymore, Mom," he said gently. But he was wrong. Something was keeping me here. Not just memories of Derek and our life together, but that unanswered question from 1982 or 83. That glimpse of something impossible that Derek and I had shared. I never saw the creature again, though I've looked. Sometimes I drive down Hosand Avenue deliberately, slowly, scanning the tree line. The area has built up now. More houses, fewer woods. Monterey Estates has streetlights and sidewalks. Progress, they call it. Last month, my granddaughter Amber stayed with me for a weekend, 16 years old and glued to her phone, but sweet as can be. On Saturday evening, we were driving back from the new shopping center that replaced Mary Lou's store years ago. It was raining, a gentle Florida drizzle just like that day. "Grandma," Amber said suddenly as we drove down Hosand Avenue, "did you see that?" My heart nearly stopped. "See what, honey?" She pointed to the small patch of undeveloped land, the last stand of woods in what used to be miles of forest. "I thought I saw someone walking in the trees, really tall." I slowed the car, peering into the gloom between the pines. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a movement. Just a shadow shifting against shadows, something large moving deeper into the trees. "Probably just a deer," I told her, but my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Amber shrugged and went back to her phone, but I knew. After all these years, it was still here, or maybe its child, or grandchild. Who knows how these things work? I've never told anyone the full story. Not Tommy or Sarah, not my friends, not even in all those years with Derek after it happened. But I'm 81 now, and some stories shouldn't die with the people who experience them. So that's what happened that winter day in Clewiston, back in 1982 or 83. Derek and I saw something that shouldn't exist, walking along Hosand Avenue. Something that left no footprints, made no sound, and disappeared like mist when we went back to look for it. I don't expect anyone to believe me. That's not why I'm telling this now. I'm telling it because it's true, and sometimes the truth is stranger than anything we could make up. And because sometimes, on rainy afternoons when I drive down that road, I still look for it. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think it might be looking for me too. Listen to the Sachi. Story 14. My name's Elaine Mercer, and I've lived in Clewiston, Florida for most of my adult life. Our home sits nestled in a thick grove of pine woods and palmettos about a mile from the hunting reservoir. It's peaceful out here, just the sounds of crickets, the occasional owl, and wind rustling through the trees. After what happened years ago, my first encounter with what I believe was a Bigfoot, I'd managed to push those memories down deep. I convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild that night. But what happened several years later made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. It was a Sunday in late October. The evening air had that perfect Florida fall crispness. Not cold, but the humidity had backed off enough to make the night comfortable. Rachel, my 17-year-old daughter, and I had gone to the 7 o'clock service at Clewiston Baptist, while my husband Marcus attended the later service at Flaghole Baptist, where his brother was a deacon. The service ran long, Pastor Wilkins had gotten particularly fired up about his sermon, and by the time we said our goodbyes to everyone in the parking lot, it was pushing 10 p.m. Rachel yawned in the passenger seat as I drove us back along the dark county road toward our home. "Mama, I've got that English paper due tomorrow," Rachel said, scrolling through her phone. "I still need to finish the conclusion." "Well, good thing tomorrow's Columbus Day. No school, so you can sleep in a bit after you finish it," I replied, turning onto the gravel driveway that wound through a quarter-mile of dense woods before reaching our house. Our headlights swept across the front of our home as we pulled up. It was a simple one-story ranch house with a wide front porch. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. I killed the engine and grabbed my purse from the back seat. "Shoot," I muttered, digging through my bag. "Rachel, I don't have my house keys." Rachel groaned, reaching for her own small purse. "I don't have mine either. I figured you had yours." I tried the front door anyway, locked tight, just as we'd left it. Marcus wouldn't be home for at least another hour, maybe more. "Let me check the windows," I said, stepping off the porch. I tried the dining room window, locked. The kitchen window, also locked. Marcus had been extra cautious about security lately, after the Johnsons' place got broken into last month. I returned to the porch where Rachel sat on the wooden swing, her phone illuminating her face in the darkness. "No luck. Everything's locked up tight," I said, sitting beside her. "Guess we'll have to wait for your daddy to get home." Rachel nodded, not looking up from her phone. "My battery's almost dead. Got your charger in the car?" "Should be in the center console," I replied. The night was quiet around us, just the familiar sounds of the Florida wilderness. The distant hoot of a barred owl, the chorus of crickets in the palmettos, the occasional splash from the reservoir about a half-mile behind our property. These were sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the years, the soundtrack of our rural life. Rachel stood up. "I'll grab the charger and be right back." She stepped off the porch and walked toward the car parked about 20 feet away. I watched her silhouette against the darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of her phone and the half-moon overhead. That's when it happened. A scream tore through the night, not from close by, but not far either. Maybe a few hundred yards into the woods behind our house, it sliced through the cricket songs and night sounds, silencing everything in an instant. I froze. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, not in all my years living alongside Florida's wildlife. It wasn't a panther's scream, which I'd heard plenty of times. It wasn't a bobcat or coyote or any bird I knew. The scream was deep, guttural at first, then rising in pitch to something almost human-like, but wrong. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but in those seconds every hair on my body stood straight up. Rachel whipped around, her face pale even in the darkness. "Mom?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Then it came again. Louder, closer, a sound that seemed to contain rage and pain and hunger all at once. It echoed through the pines, bouncing between the trees until it seemed to come from everywhere. "Get in the car!" I shouted, already moving down the porch steps. "Rachel, now!" We both ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. My heart pounded so hard I felt it might burst from my chest. Rachel reached the car first, yanking open the driver's side door and diving in. I was seconds behind her, slamming the door shut and hitting the lock button. "What was that?" Rachel's voice trembled. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. "I don't know," I whispered, though something deep inside me did know. It triggered a memory I'd worked hard to suppress, of another night years ago, another encounter in these same woods. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us breathing heavily, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing but our ragged breathing fogging up the car windows. "Should we call Dad?" Rachel asked, her voice small. I nodded, taking her phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed Marcus's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He's probably still in service, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Signal's always bad at Flag Hole anyway. Another scream ripped through the night, this one farther away but still bone-chilling. Rachel grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Mom, what is that?" Her voice cracked. "I don't know, honey," I lied. I didn't want to frighten her more by sharing my suspicions. We sat in that car for what felt like hours. I kept trying Marcus every few minutes, but kept getting his voicemail. Rachel's phone battery dipped lower and lower. "Don't use the flashlight anymore," I told her. "Save what's left of your battery." We sat in darkness, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of branches. I kept the keys in the ignition, ready to start the car and flee if necessary, though I wasn't sure where we would go. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away down the county road. At 11:37 p.m., I remember checking Rachel's phone. We heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights swung into the driveway. Marcus's truck. "It's Dad," Rachel said, relief flooding her voice. I hesitated before unlocking the doors. "Wait." I watched carefully as Marcus's truck came to a stop beside our car. I could see him clearly in the glow of his dashboard lights, his familiar profile, the baseball cap he always wore to church, despite my objections. It was definitely him. "Okay, let's go," I said, unlocking the doors. We climbed out just as Marcus stepped from his truck. "What are you all doing sitting in the car?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. I rushed to him, Rachel close behind. "Marcus, there's something in the woods." He frowned, looking past us into the darkness. "What do you mean?" "We heard screams," Rachel said, her voice steadier now that her father was here, "like nothing I've ever heard before." Marcus's expression softened. He put an arm around Rachel's shoulders. "Probably just a panther, sweetheart. They sound almost human when they scream." I shook my head firmly. "No, Marcus. I know what a panther sounds like. This wasn't that." Marcus sighed, pulling his house keys from his pocket. "Let's get inside, and you can tell me all about it. It's been a long day, and y'all are probably just tired." I bristled at his dismissal, but followed him to the front door. The woods remained silent as he unlocked the door and ushered us inside. I kept looking back over my shoulder, searching the tree line for any movement, any pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Once inside, Marcus locked the door and flipped on the lights. Our home suddenly felt too small, the windows too numerous and vulnerable. I moved through the house, checking each window, drawing curtains closed. "Elaine, you're scaring Rachel," Marcus said from the kitchen where he was pouring himself a glass of sweet tea. I glanced at our daughter, who did indeed look shaken as she sat at the dining room table, her phone plugged into the wall charger. "I'm sorry," I said, sitting down next to her. "I didn't mean to frighten you more." Marcus joined us, setting his glass down with a solid thunk. "Now, tell me exactly what you heard." I described the scream as best I could, its pitch, its duration, the way it had silenced all other forest sounds. Rachel nodded along, adding details I'd missed. "And it screamed 3 times, she said. "The second one was closest." Marcus rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Could have been a lot of things. Bobcat, maybe, or even wild hogs fighting. They make some ungodly noises." "It wasn't a bobcat or hogs," I insisted. "Marcus, remember what I told you about what I saw years ago, when Rachel was just a little girl?" His expression hardened. We'd had this conversation many times over the years. He'd never believed my story about the tall, hair-covered creature I'd glimpsed moving through our property one night while he was away on a hunting trip. "Elaine, we're not going down that road again," he said firmly. "There's no such thing as Bigfoot, especially not in Florida." "There's the skunk ape legends," Rachel said quietly. "We learned about it in Florida history class last year. Native American stories going back hundreds of years." Marcus shook his head. "Legends and stories, that's all. Look, I'm not saying you didn't hear something unusual. These woods are full of wildlife. But jumping to fairy tales isn't helping anything. I bit my tongue. There was no point arguing with Marcus when he got like this. But I knew what I'd heard and what I'd seen years before. "Let's all get some sleep," Marcus suggested, finishing his tea. "Everything seems less scary in the daylight." Rachel nodded and stood up. "I still need to finish my English paper." "Do it tomorrow," Marcus said. "It's late and you're upset." "No, I'd rather finish it now," she replied. "It'll help take my mind off things." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but just nodded. "All right, don't stay up too late." After Rachel disappeared into her room, Marcus turned to me. "You really scared her, you know." "I didn't scare her," I said, keeping my voice low. "Whatever's in those woods scared her, scared us both." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Elaine, I know you believe what you believe, but filling Rachel's head with this Bigfoot nonsense isn't right." "I never said the word Bigfoot to her," I replied. "Not tonight, not ever, but something's out there, Marcus. Something that doesn't belong." He shook his head again and stood up. "I'm taking a shower, then heading to bed. You coming?" "In a bit," I said. After Marcus left, I sat alone at the dining room table, listening to the house settle around me. The air conditioner hummed. The refrigerator kicked on with a soft whir. Normal sounds, safe sounds, but my mind kept returning to that scream, primal, angry, and so very close to our home. I walked to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out into the darkness. The motion-activated security light illuminated our backyard, casting long shadows from the pine trees at the edge of the woods. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The next morning, after Marcus left for work and Rachel was deep into finishing her paper, I pulled on my rubber boots and ventured outside. The October morning was bright and clear, the dew still heavy on the grass. Birds sang in the trees, and a squirrel chattered angrily as I approached the edge of the woods. Nature had resumed its normal rhythms, as if last night had never happened. I walked slowly along the tree line, looking for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, unusual tracks, tufts of hair caught on the rough bark of the pines. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I needed to look, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. About 200 yards from the house, I found it. A pine sapling, about as thick as my wrist, snapped clean in half about 6 feet off the ground. The break was fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. No storm had passed through recently. No reason for this tree to be broken. I examined the ground beneath the broken sapling. The soil was sandy here, and in one patch I found what looked like a partial footprint, much larger than any human foot, with what appeared to be 5 distinct toes. My heart raced as I crouched down for a closer look. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" I startled at Rachel's voice, nearly losing my balance. I straightened up quickly, positioning myself to block her view of the footprint. "Just checking for storm damage," I lied, gesturing vaguely at the broken sapling. Rachel looked skeptical. She had her father's sharp eyes and analytical mind. "There hasn't been a storm in weeks." "Well, sometimes damage takes a while to show up," I said, knowing how weak it sounded. "Finished your paper?" She nodded. "Just submitted it online. Dad called. He wants us to meet him for lunch at Jenkins' barbecue around noon." "Sounds good," I said, guiding her back toward the house, away from my discovery. "Let me just change my clothes and we can head into town." As we walked, Rachel suddenly stopped. "Mom, do you really think it was what people call a skunk ape?" I hesitated. I'd been careful over the years not to share my first encounter with Rachel. I hadn't wanted to frighten her or make her feel unsafe in our home. But she was practically an adult now, intelligent and perceptive. "I don't know what it was," I said carefully. "But I know what it wasn't. It wasn't any animal I'm familiar with, and I've lived alongside Florida wildlife my whole life. Rachel nodded slowly. I looked up animal sounds online last night. Played recordings of panthers, bobcats, bears, everything native to Florida. None of them matched what we heard. A chill ran down my spine despite the morning warmth. What do you think it was? She shrugged, looking back toward the woods. I don't know, but I think you've heard it before, haven't you? Or seen something. I sighed. Rachel was too perceptive for her own good sometimes. Once, years ago, I never told you because I didn't want to scare you. I'm not scared, she said, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. I just want to know the truth. I put my arm around her shoulders as we continued walking. The truth is, there are things in this world we don't fully understand. Things science hasn't explained or categorized. Does that mean it's a skunk ape or Bigfoot? I can't say for certain, but I know what I saw years ago, and I know what we heard last night. Rachel leaned into me slightly. Dad will never believe it. No, I agreed. He won't. Your father needs things to fit into neat, explainable boxes. Always has. We reached the house and climbed the porch steps. Before we went inside, Rachel turned to me. Can we set up a game camera, like the ones Dad uses for hunting? Maybe we could catch it on video. I considered this. Your father would notice. Not if we put it somewhere he doesn't go, she suggested. Like on that old oak tree behind the shed. It faces the woods, and Dad never goes back there because of the poison ivy. I couldn't help but smile at her determination. Maybe. Let me think about it. Later that day, as we sat across from Marcus at Jenkins' barbecue, picking at pulled pork sandwiches and sweet potato fries, I found myself studying my husband's face. The face I'd loved for 23 years. Kind, practical, steadfast, but also stubborn and unwilling to consider anything outside his limited worldview. Something wrong with your sandwich? He asked, noticing my distraction. I shook my head. Just thinking. About last night? His voice lowered. Elaine, you've got to let this go. You're working yourself up over nothing. Rachel caught my eye across the table. A silent message passed between us. A new alliance formed in the face of Marcus's skepticism. You're right, I said, surprising both Marcus and Rachel. Probably just an unusual animal call. Nothing to worry about. Marcus looked relieved. Exactly. Probably won't happen again anyway. Probably not, I agreed, taking a bite of my sandwich. Under the table, Rachel's foot tapped mine. I tapped back. We would set up that camera. We would find proof of what lurked in our woods. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus would finally have to believe. But even as I made these plans, a part of me hoped we'd find nothing. Because the alternative, confirming that something large, unknown, and potentially dangerous was living just yards from our home, was almost too terrifying to contemplate. That blood-curdling scream still echoed in my mind. Whatever had made that sound wasn't just passing through, it was staking a claim, marking territory, and our home sat right in the middle of it. Story 15. The crisp November air bit at my exposed skin as I loaded the last of my equipment into the truck. My breath formed clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. It was my third day in Johnson County, Arkansas, and I hadn't found a damn thing. Not a footprint, not a hair sample, nothing. Just stories from locals about something in these woods. I'm Dr. Thomas Blackwood, wildlife researcher with 20 years of field experience from the Pacific Northwest to the Appalachians. I've tracked wolves in Idaho, studied black bear populations in Maine, and spent 3 years documenting coyote behavior in the Southwest. But this assignment brought me to the Ozark Mountains to investigate something potentially more significant than anything I'd studied before. Vernon Harmon, a 54-year-old turkey hunter who'd spent his entire life in these hills, reported seeing 3 hairy bipedal figures crossing a clearing near Elkins Hollow on November 2nd. I'd interviewed Vernon yesterday at his small farmhouse just outside Harmony. "I know what I saw, Dr. Blackwood," he told me, his calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Weren't bears. Bears don't walk upright for 200 yards. Weren't people neither, too big, too hairy. Moved like they belonged here, not like hikers stumbling through. 3 of them, 1 big one, 2 smaller ones." I documented his testimony, checked his background, respected community member, no history of fabrication, and determined the sighting location. Tonight would be my last attempt to gather evidence before my research grant required me to move on to another site. I drove down the winding county road, turning onto unpaved National Forest Road 223, my headlights illuminating the thick tree trunks on either side. At 11:45 p.m., I reached my destination, a small pull-off where NFR 223 bordered private hunting land owned by the Tanner family. I killed the engine and sat in darkness, letting my eyes adjust. Elkins Hollow spread out before me, a deep wooded ravine with a small creek running through its center. The half-moon provided just enough illumination to make out the basic topography. The air temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, according to my truck's thermometer. Perfect conditions for thermal imaging. I set up my equipment methodically: parabolic microphone, digital recorder, night vision monocular, thermal imaging camera, and various scent lures designed to attract large mammals. Years of field research had taught me patience. I would observe silently for the first hour, then progressively introduce stimuli to provoke a response from any wildlife in the area. By 1 a.m., I'd recorded nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of an Ozark forest at night. Distant owl calls, the occasional rustling of nocturnal rodents in the leaf litter, the soft gurgle of the creek below. I decided to move to the next phase of my investigation. I reached into my truck and activated the external speaker system I'd mounted earlier that day. The recorded sounds of chimpanzee calls echoed through the hollow, a technique I'd used successfully to draw responses from unknown primates in other regions. The recordings played for 3 minutes before I shut them off, returning the forest to silence. 15 minutes passed. Nothing. I switched to a different recording, this one containing the alleged vocalizations of what researchers in the Pacific Northwest called Sasquatch. Low, guttural whoops and howls filled the darkness, bouncing off the ridgelines. I let this play for 2 minutes before cutting it off. 10 more minutes of silence followed. I was reaching for my thermos of coffee when I heard it. A deep, melodic whistle from the ridge directly across the hollow. I froze, my hand suspended in mid-air. The sound came again, 3 distinct notes in a falling pattern. My first thought: another researcher. Maybe someone from the University of Arkansas had heard about the sightings and decided to investigate. But that made no sense. I'd checked with all the relevant departments before coming here. No one else was conducting field studies in this area. My second thought: a hunter. But it was 1:27 a.m. in November, well past legal hunting hours, and the whistling pattern wasn't typical of hunters signaling each other. The third possibility made my skin prickle, exactly what I'd come here to find. I grabbed my parabolic microphone and pointed it toward the sound's origin. The whistle came again, this time with 5 distinct notes, more complex than before. I activated my digital recorder and fumbled for my night vision monocular. Through the green-tinted view of the monocular, I could see the opposite ridge clearly: dense trees, brushy undergrowth, a few rocky outcroppings. Nothing moved, but the whistle came again, unmistakably from that direction. Then I heard it: crashing brush, the sound of something large moving through the forest. Not the careful steps of a deer or even the shambling walk of a black bear. This was bipedal, heavy, deliberate. And it wasn't moving away from me, it was coming toward me. I swung the thermal camera in the direction of the sound, but the dense foliage blocked any clear heat signature. The crashing grew louder, more urgent. Whatever it was had reached the creek that ran through the bottom of the hollow. Splash! Water sprayed as something large crossed the creek. I estimated the distance at about 100 yards from my position. My heart hammered in my chest as I frantically adjusted the thermal camera. Still nothing visible. The sounds of movement continued up the near bank, branches snapping under significant weight, leaves rustling. Then silence, complete silence. Even the background forest sounds had stopped. I held my breath, scanning with both night vision and thermal imaging. Nothing appeared in either device. Whatever had crossed that creek had vanished or gone completely still. I estimated it had stopped about 75 yards from my truck. Minutes passed. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. I'd been in close proximity to grizzlies in Montana, face-down territorial bull moose in Alaska, but something about this encounter sent a primal fear through me that I couldn't rationalize. I decided it was time to leave. I began slowly packing my equipment, keeping my movements deliberate and quiet. As I disconnected the parabolic microphone, a sharp sound cracked through the night, like a small-caliber rifle shot, but not quite. It came from the ridge opposite my position, not from where the creature had gone silent. Before I could process this, another sound followed, the distinctive crack of a large, dry branch being deliberately broken against a tree trunk. Then another, and another. 3 sharp wooden breaks in rapid succession. I'd heard descriptions of this behavior before from researchers in Washington and Oregon, territorial displays attributed to Sasquatch. They'd break branches or slam them against trees to warn intruders away from their territory. I stood frozen beside my truck, equipment half-packed, listening as the forest fell silent again. After 5 minutes of nothing, I finished loading my gear with trembling hands and got into the driver's seat. I started the engine but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, I flipped on my digital recorder and spoke into it, documenting what had just happened while the experience was fresh. November 15th, 2006, 1:53 a.m. Elkins Hollow, after playing recorded primate calls, received whistled response from Northeast Ridge. Subject moved directly toward my position, crossed creek approximately 100 yards away, lost visual and audio contact until subject on opposite ridge produced wood-knocking sounds consistent with territorial display. Weather conditions clear, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, no visual confirmation obtained. I put the truck in drive and slowly pulled away, keeping my lights on low beam. As I followed the winding forest road back toward the main highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the darkness between the trees. 2 weeks later, I returned to Johnson County. I'd analyzed my audio recordings and found distinct patterns in the whistles that matched no known wildlife in the region. The wood-knocking sounds were clear and unambiguous on the recordings. I needed more data, more evidence. This time, I arrived during daylight hours and took a different approach. I spoke with local hunters who used the area regularly. Most gave me skeptical looks or told me the usual stories about bears mistaken for something else. But on my second day back, I encountered a hunting party at the general store in Harmony, and one of their members, Jackson Reeves, overheard me asking the clerk about recent wildlife sightings. "You that wildlife fella?" he asked, approaching me with a coffee in one hand. "The one asking about strange critters?" I nodded and introduced myself. Jackson was 60 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of decades outdoors. He wore a faded camouflage jacket and a blaze orange cap. "Might have something you'd want to hear about," he said. "Happened 3 days ago up in my deer stand near Elkins Hollow." We sat at a small table in the corner of the store. Jackson spoke quietly, his eyes darting occasionally to see if anyone else was listening. "Been hunting these woods all my life," he began. "Know every sound they make, every critter, every season. But what I heard Monday morning, never heard nothing like it before." Jackson had been in his deer stand since 5 a.m., waiting for first light. Around 6:30, just as dawn was breaking, he heard a whistle. Not a bird whistle, he emphasized. Not a person whistling neither. Deep, like it came from something with a chest bigger than mine. 3 notes, then 5, then 3 again. The hair on my arm stood up. The pattern matched what I'd recorded. It was moving, Jackson continued. Started on the north side of the hollow, then worked its way across, real methodical-like. Got within maybe 100 yards of my stand. Did you see anything? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He shook his head. Too dark still. But here's the strange part. Every animal in them woods went dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. When that thing was moving through, it was like everything else was holding its breath. Jackson had hunted that same spot for over 40 years and had never experienced anything like it. When I mentioned similar reports from other areas, he nodded slowly. My granddaddy used to talk about the whistler in these hills, he said. Said it wasn't something to fear unless you bothered it. Said it's been here longer than us. I spent the rest of the day with Jackson, mapping exactly where his stand was located and the direction the whistling had moved. It formed a clear pattern with my earlier experience. The same area, similar vocalizations, the same effect on other wildlife. That evening, I returned to Elkins Hollow, this time with more sophisticated recording equipment. I set up 3 remote audio stations at different points around the hollow, each with motion-activated cameras. I positioned myself on the ridge where I'd heard the wood knocking 2 weeks earlier. Nothing happened for the first 4 hours. Around midnight, one of my remote sensors triggered. I checked the receiver and saw that the easternmost station had detected movement. I trained my night vision equipment in that direction, but saw nothing. Then my radio crackled. The unmistakable sound of whistling came through the speaker. The same pattern I'd heard before. 3 notes, 5 notes, 3 notes. The audio quality was crystal clear on the digital equipment. I quickly triangulated the position based on which sensor had picked up the sound. Whatever was whistling stood approximately 200 yards east of my position, deep in the densest part of the forest. I grabbed my thermal camera and headed in that direction, moving as quietly as possible over the leaf-covered ground. The forest floor dipped into a small ravine, then rose again toward a stand of old-growth oak trees. As I reached the bottom of the ravine, the whistling stopped. I froze, listening. Nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I scanned with the thermal camera, sweeping slowly from left to right. The screen showed heat signatures of small animals, probably rodents, and the residual warmth of rocks that had absorbed the day's sunlight. Nothing large enough to account for what I'd heard. I took another step forward, and a twig snapped under my boot. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. From directly ahead came a response, not whistling this time, but a deep, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. It vibrated in my chest, primal and threatening. I raised the thermal camera with shaking hands. For a brief moment, no more than 2 seconds, the screen showed a large bipedal heat signature approximately 50 yards ahead. It was at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky torso. Then it moved behind a large tree trunk and disappeared from the thermal view. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to advance or retreat. My scientific training battled with instinctual fear. I needed to document this, to get closer, to gather evidence, but everything in my body screamed to run. The growl came again, louder this time. Then the sound of heavy footsteps, moving away, thankfully. Branches cracked as whatever it was retreated deeper into the forest. I tracked the sounds until they faded completely. When I could no longer hear anything, I slowly backed away, maintaining my focus on the direction where I'd last detected movement. I returned to my original position and collected my equipment, including the remote sensors. Later that night, in the safety of my motel room, I reviewed the data. The audio recordings had captured the whistles clearly. The thermal camera had documented that brief glimpse of a large upright figure. It wasn't conclusive. Any peer review would dismiss it as too brief and unclear, but it was enough to justify further research. I compiled my findings into a preliminary report, including Vernon Harmon's initial sighting, my first encounter, Jackson Reeves's experience, and tonight's events. The evidence suggested the presence of at least one unclassified primate species in the Ozark National Forest. The behavioral patterns, territorial displays, complex vocalizations, deliberate avoidance of human observation, matched reports from other regions of North America. My grant would allow me to return to Johnson County for a more extensive study in the spring. Next time, I would bring a full research team and more sophisticated equipment. We would conduct a systematic survey of Elkins Hollow and the surrounding areas. As I finalized my notes, I played back the whistling sounds one more time. The complex melodic pattern didn't match any known animal species in North America. Whatever I'd encountered in those remote hollows of Arkansas represented something science had yet to formally acknowledge. A large, intelligent primate species that had somehow remained hidden from official documentation despite decades of anecdotal reports. I closed my laptop and looked out the motel window at the dark outline of the Ozark Mountains against the night sky. Out there, something watched and waited. Something that whistled in the darkness and moved through the forest with purpose. Something that had called these hills home long before humans named them. I would be back, and next time I would be better prepared to document what lurked in Elkins Hollow.